letter arrived on a Wednesday morning, tucked inside a stack of household invoices and correspondence that Evelyn had learned, over 11 years of marriage, to sort without thinking. She sat at her writing desk in the east-facing morning room, the one that caught the light best in early autumn, and she moved through the pile with the practiced efficiency of a woman who had long since stopped expecting anything to surprise her. A bill from the florist on Regent Street, which was slightly higher than she expected, and which she would note without mentioning, because it was not the sort of thing worth making into a conversation. A note from her sister in York, written in the breathless, affectionate script that had not changed since they were girls, asking whether Evelyn intended to come north before the winter set in. An invitation to a charity luncheon she would decline with a politely worded excuse, because the luncheon was on a Thursday and Thursdays were when she did the estate accounts, and the estate accounts were not something she left for another day. And then, near the bottom of the pile, a single cream envelope that bore no return address, and had been addressed in a handwriting she did not recognize. She did not open it immediately. That was one of the things people had never understood about Evelyn Ashford Crane, Duchess of Westhaven, and it was one of the things that made her, in the estimation of people who knew her well, rather unlike most of the women they moved among. She never rushed. Not toward good news, not away from bad. She had observed, over the course of her life, that the people who rushed toward things were often the same people who later regretted how those things had unfolded, and she had decided, some years ago, that this was a pattern she had no interest in repeating. So she set the envelope aside, finished her tea, reviewed the florist's bill and made her note, and wrote a brief reply to her sister before she finally reached for the silver letter opener that had been her father's, and drew it cleanly across the seal. Inside was a single folded sheet of paper. No greeting at the top, no signature at the bottom. Just 4 lines of neat, careful handwriting, placed in the center of the page with a precision that suggested the writer had been trained, at some point in their life, to care about the positioning of words on a page. The handwriting was a woman's, the content was not. She read those 4 lines once, slowly, without expression. Then she folded the letter in thirds, returned it to the envelope and placed it beneath the leather blotter on the left side of her writing desk, which was where she kept things that required further thought, before she could decide what to do with them. She rang the small brass bell beside the inkstand, when the housemaid, a girl named Lucy who had been with them 3 years, and who was reliable and quiet, and exactly what Evelyn valued in a household employee, brought fresh tea. Evelyn thanked her by name, as she always did, and asked whether the roses on the south wall had been pruned yet this week. Lucy said they had not, that Mr. Harley had been occupied with the drainage problem along the east fence. Evelyn made a note to speak to Mr. Harley, because the drainage problem was important, but the roses also required attention, and both things could be managed if she spoke to the right person at the right moment. Then she sat back in her chair, looked out at the gray October sky above Westhaven's lawns, and thought very carefully about what she intended to do next. She did not begin thinking in the frantic, circular way that she had observed in other people when they received unwelcome information. She had never thought that way. She thought the way her father had taught her to think, which was methodically and from the beginning. What do I know? What do I not know? What do I need to find out? And what is the sequence in which I need to find it out? Her father had been a barrister of the old school, the kind who believed that the presentation of a case was only as strong as the preparation behind it, and he had passed this belief to his daughter as other fathers passed silver or land. She had received it gratefully and used it well. She had been born Evelyn Margaret Ashford, the eldest of 2 daughters, in a house in Kensington that was smaller than most people assumed, given her father's professional reputation. Edmund Ashford, barrister, was a man whose standing in his field was significant, but whose financial relationship with success had always been, to put it kindly, complicated. He was brilliant in court, impeccable on paper, and entirely unable to manage his own affairs with the discipline he brought to his clients. This had been known in the household and managed quietly by her mother, a woman named Catherine who had been born Catherine Wells, the daughter of a Gloucestershire physician, and who had possessed in equal measure great beauty, great practicality, and the particular quality of resolve that allowed her to manage difficult situations without appearing to manage anything at all. Evelyn had learned most of what she knew from watching her mother. She had learned the rest from her father's library, which she had had the freedom of from a young age, and which contained more useful things than her formal education had. She had married Richard Crane, the Duke of Westhaven, at 23. The wedding had taken place in June, in a church in the city that was full of people in their best clothes, who all appeared to believe they were witnessing the natural culmination of 2 compatible people finding one another. That was the story as it was told. Evelyn had been privately aware, even then, that the story was not the whole truth, and that the fuller truth was considerably less romantic. She was 23 and Richard was 33, and she was the elder daughter of a barrister of distinguished reputation and insufficient income, and he was the holder of a title that came with 3 estates, a seat in certain important rooms, and a level of social expectation that required above all else, the right kind of wife. She was the right kind of wife. She had known it, and Richard had known it, and their families had known it, and the guests in the church had also known it, in the unconscious, comfortable way that people know things they have never needed to articulate. She had not been naive about this. She had never had the luxury of naivety, which she had always considered one of the underrated gifts of growing up in a family where money was a quiet and persistent pressure rather than a comfortable absence. Naivety required a certain cushioning from reality, and she had not had that. She had understood what she was entering, and she had entered it with open eyes and the same precise calculation she brought to everything. What she had not fully accounted for was the particular loneliness of a life in which the person beside you has met all of the formal requirements of presence without any of the informal requirements of genuine company. Richard was not a cruel man. He was not in any obvious way a bad man. He was charming in public and remote in private, and the remoteness had the quality of a river that looks still from the bank but has no current underneath. He was present at dinners, attentive at public occasions, reliably correct in his behavior toward her within the sight of others. But in the private life of the house, he was largely absent, not physically, always, but in every more important sense. He occupied his rooms, she occupied hers. They shared a table and a name and the care of 2 children. And beyond that, the daily texture of their relationship was the texture of polite acquaintance. She had made her peace with this, in the way that people make peace with things they cannot change by deciding not to waste energy they could spend on something useful. She had built a life of her own within the larger life. Her work for the Women's Hospital Charity, which she had been involved with for 7 years and which had benefited considerably from her presence on the committee, her correspondence, which was extensive and which she maintained with the same care she brought to everything, her friendships, which were few and real rather than many and decorative, her reading, which was wide and which she protected fiercely, because she had learned that a person who does not read widely becomes someone whose thoughts are only as large as their direct experience, and she had always believed that was an unnecessary limitation. And her management of the estates, which Richard had ceded to her gradually over the first 3 years of their marriage, partly because he was not interested in it, and partly because it had quickly become obvious that she was considerably better at it than he was. She had not been unhappy. She had been occupied and capable and respected in her sphere, and she had the children, who were the great and uncomplicated love of her life, and she had had enough to sustain herself for 11 years without the thing she had not had, which was a marriage in the real sense of the word. She had reached a kind of equilibrium with all of this, a steady, workable arrangement that she did not examine too closely because examining it too closely would have served no purpose. And then the letter came. She thought about it for 3 days before she made a single move. During those 3 days, she continued every aspect of her life without alteration. She attended her charity committee meeting on the Thursday, where she made 2 practical observations about the fundraising schedule that were immediately adopted. She oversaw the household accounts on Friday morning. She took Henry, her 9-year-old son, riding on Saturday afternoon, and listened to him talk about a project he was constructing out of cardboard and wire in the nursery that was meant to represent the structure of a suspension bridge. She attended church on Sunday with both children, and afterward walked home with Caroline, her 6-year-old daughter, who insisted on carrying her own small bag and on stopping to look at every interesting leaf along the route. She did all of this without a flicker of disturbance visible to anyone who observed her. On the 4th day, she wrote a letter to Mr. Aldous Finch. She used her own notepaper and her own name and posted it herself, walking to the box on the corner of the square in the thin October morning, because she was not yet ready to involve the household in any of what was coming, and every element of caution she could practice at this stage was worth practicing. The letter asked Mr. Finch whether he would be available to call on her at his earliest convenience, at a time when the Duke was away from the house, to discuss a matter of some importance. She signed it in full, as she always did, and posted it, and walked back through the morning air. Mr. Aldous Finch was 61 years old, and had been a solicitor for 40 of them. He had handled the affairs of her father's estate, and subsequently certain matters relating to her mother's property, and he was one of perhaps 3 people in the world whom Evelyn trusted with anything that required both intelligence and the very specific kind of discretion that goes beyond professional obligation into genuine, personal reliability. He was a small man, neat in the way of people who have organized their lives so completely that the organization extends to their physical presentation. He wore good but unobtrusive clothes. He had a short gray beard, kept with precision. He had the habit, when listening to something important, of folding his hands on the table in front of him and remaining very still, and the quality of his stillness was such that the person speaking always felt that everything they said was being received with complete attention. He came on the following Thursday. Richard was away for 3 days, visiting an associate at a shooting estate in Norfolk, and the morning room was the quietest room in the house at that hour. Evelyn had asked for tea to be brought and then not to be disturbed, a request that the household interpreted without question, because the Duchess was a person whose requests were reliable signals of something she had already thought through. She closed the door and told Mr. Finch, plainly and without embellishment, what the letter had said. She showed it to him. He read it once, then returned it to her without comment, and she placed it back beneath the blotter. She told him what she had observed and suspected over the preceding months, laying out the information in the order she had assembled it in her own mind, which was the order of relevance, rather than the order in which she had come to it. She was careful to distinguish between what she knew and what she inferred, because the distinction mattered, and because she respected Finch too much to blur it. When she had finished, he was quiet for a moment, his hands folded in the characteristic way, his expression neither shocked nor unsympathetic, but simply attentive. "And what would you like me to do, Lady Evelyn?" he asked. She had her answer ready. "I would like you to find out how much of it is true," she said. "All of it. Every detail. I want documentation, not impressions. And I want it assembled in a form that would hold up to professional scrutiny." "And the extent of the investigation," he said. "There are different levels of thoroughness." "The most thorough level," she said. "I have no interest in doing this halfway." He nodded, with the economy of a man to whom clarity was a professional pleasure. "How long?" he asked. "Take as long as it requires," she said, "but I would prefer it complete before winter." "That gives me approximately 6 weeks," he said. "That should be sufficient," she said. "You are a thorough man." He accepted this without false modesty, because it was accurate and he knew it. He finished his tea, put on his coat, and took his leave with the minimum of ceremony, and she walked him to the door herself, and when she came back she sat at her writing desk for a long time without picking up a pen or a letter or anything else. She sat looking at the garden. The oak at the far end of the east lawn was turning, its leaves going from green to the particular gold that autumn produced in those late October days when the light still had some warmth in it. She had lived in this house for 11 years. She knew every corner of it. She knew the way the morning light came through the east windows and the way the house settled in the cold and the particular quality of silence it had in the small hours when the children were asleep and nothing moved. She had built her life here, with a thoroughness and a commitment that she believed had been genuine, even in its practical nature. She had been a good wife in every external sense. She had been an excellent mother. She had managed the estates and the household and the charity and the social obligations and all of the invisible labor of a life like hers with a competence that had been taken for granted so completely that it had become invisible, which was, she supposed, the best measure of how well it had been done. She thought about that for a while. She thought about invisibility as an achievement, and what it cost, and what it bought, and then she thought about the 4 lines on the cream paper beneath her blotter, and about the specific, quiet weight of what they represented, and about the fact that she had, somewhere in the landscape of the last several years, stopped being surprised by the things that made a person's life smaller than it should have been. She had accommodated so many things, over so many years, in the reasonable belief that accommodation was the dignified and adult response to circumstances she could not change. And what she realized, sitting at her writing desk on that October morning, looking at the gold oak at the end of the east lawn, was that she was no longer certain that accommodation was the right word for it. She picked up her pen. She opened the household accounts notebook to the next blank page. She wrote the date at the top, in her small, clear hand. She thought for another moment, then she wrote, underneath the date, the difference between enduring a life and choosing one. She looked at that sentence for a while. Then she turned the page and began the estate accounts for October, which were waiting and which required her attention, and which she completed with the same careful accuracy she always brought to them. She was not a woman who let one part of her life become a casualty of another part. She had never believed in that kind of spillage. Everything in its place, done properly, and the larger thing held steady underneath. She would wait for Finch, she would prepare, and when she was ready, entirely and completely and without any remaining gap in the preparation, she would move. That was how she had always done things. That was how this would be done. Outside, a gust of wind moved through the east lawn, and the gold oak shed a dozen leaves at once, and they drifted down through the still air and settled on the grass below with a quietness that was almost like a decision being made. She had thought, in the years before the letter, that she had made her peace with the fundamental nature of the arrangement. Peace was perhaps not the right word. She had made her accommodation with it, which was a more precise description. She had chosen, day by day, to attend to the things she could improve, and not to attend to the things she could not. And this approach had produced a life that was, by most external measures, a successful one. She ran 3 estates. She was consulted on matters of household and community that had once been Richard's nominal concern, and were now practically hers. She had raised 2 children who were, by the only measure she cared about, genuinely themselves, curious, honest, kind without being naive, and possessed of the specific quality of assurance that comes to children who have been listened to carefully by the adults responsible for them. She had built all of that. It was hers in a way that the marriage itself had never quite been hers, and now she was sitting at her writing desk with a letter beneath her blotter that told her the ground of the last 11 years was less solid than it had appeared from the surface, and she was deciding what to do about it. The question was not whether to do something. She had known in the first reading of those 4 lines that she would act. The question was how, and when, and with what precision. These were the questions she had always been best at answering. She would answer them now. She thought about her father's voice, reading briefs to himself in the small study on the 2nd floor of the Kensington house, working through the logic of a case in the particular allowed but private way he had, turning the argument over and over until every angle of it was clear. She had sat outside that study door sometimes, as a girl of 10 or 11, listening to his voice without hearing the words, and had absorbed something from the rhythm of it, the rhythm of a mind working through something that mattered, slowly and without rush, until it was ready. She was her father's daughter. She would take the time it required. She picked up her pen and made a small note in the household accounts notebook. Something about the florist's bill, a perfectly ordinary notation in perfectly ordinary handwriting, because life continued while plans were formed, and the ordinary tasks of an ordinary day were not to be neglected simply because something beneath the ordinary had shifted. Her mother had taught her that too. The way to manage a large thing was to keep all the small things exactly in order, because the small things were where the large thing was held together. She finished the notation. She closed the notebook. She allowed herself one more look at the gold oak at the end of the east lawn, which was doing the thing that oak trees do in late autumn, when they are very old and very large and the season is turning, holding the light in a way that made them look briefly, magnificently, like something more than trees. Then she straightened in her chair and turned to the morning's remaining correspondence. There was a great deal to do. There always was. She had always found this a comfort. She thought about the estate accounts that evening, not because they required her attention, because they did not that particular evening when the household was still in the quiet aftermath of the dinner, and Mr. Graves had managed the morning clearing with his usual efficiency and everything that needed doing had been done. She thought about them because they were a useful object for thought, they were concrete, and they were hers in a way that almost nothing else in this house had been wholly hers, and they were the record of 11 years of competence that Richard had never quite acknowledged, but that had sustained the financial health of 3 estates and a household of 40 people through a period of economic uncertainty that had tested many comparable establishments and found them wanting. She had been good at it, better than Richard, better than most of the estate managers she had interacted with on behalf of the West Haven properties, most of whom had found, in their first professional exchange with her, that she was not the kind of wife who took a polite interest in her husband's holdings, but rather the kind who could discuss yield ratios and drainage improvement costs and the long-term implications of tenant lease restructuring, with a precision that had occasionally caused visible surprise and had subsequently caused visible respect, which she had always preferred. 11 years of that competence. 11 years of doing, quietly and without acknowledgement, and with only the satisfaction of the work itself to sustain it, something that was worth doing, and worth doing well. She was not, now that she was on the other side of the larger decision, resentful of those 11 years. She had found, in examining her feelings about this period with the honesty she tried to apply to everything, that resentment was not among them. The 11 years had given her something, alongside everything they had cost her. They had given her a level of mastery in a field that very few women of her position had been given the opportunity to develop. The circumstances of the mastery were not the circumstances she would have chosen, but the mastery was real, and it was hers, and she intended to carry it with her into whatever came next. Whatever came next included Edinburgh, and the book that was beginning to take shape in the notebooks, and the charity work that she would continue, and the children who were the living center of everything she intended. It included the legal process that was now in motion, and that she would navigate with the same steady attention she gave to all processes. It included the practical management of the transition period, which she was already thinking about in the specific, enumerated way she always thought about transitions. What needs to happen? In what order? Managed by whom? With what resources? By what date? She had a list. She always had a list. She went to her writing desk and made it more specific. The woman's name was Clara Hargrove, and she had arrived in London from Bath the previous year with the particular quality of composure that belongs to people who have survived something and come out the other side of it with their sense of themselves intact. Her husband, a man named Frederick Hargrove, who had been 12 years her senior and who had been in shipping, had died of a chest illness 3 years prior, leaving her with a modest income, a house she subsequently sold, and the freedom that widowhood provides in a world where marriage is the primary container of a woman's life. She was 31 years old, which was the precise age at which a woman was old enough to be taken seriously and young enough to be considered interesting. And she had a quality of warmth that was genuine, without being indiscriminate, and a kind of intelligence that expressed itself in attention to the people she was talking to, rather than in the performance of cleverness for its own sake. Evelyn learned all of this from Mr. Finch's report, which arrived on a Tuesday morning in the 3rd week of November, delivered by hand to the address of her sister in London, which was the rerouting she had arranged, to ensure that nothing connected to any of this came directly to the house. She had written to her sister several weeks earlier, asking whether she might use her address for a brief period for correspondence of a personal nature that she preferred to keep separate. Her sister, who loved her and trusted her, and who had the good sense to know that asking detailed questions of Evelyn Ashford Crane was rarely productive, had agreed without pressing for an explanation. The report was 8 pages long, written in Finch's characteristically small and precise hand, with dates and names and sources noted in the margins. Evelyn read it at her writing desk on the morning it arrived, having collected it herself on a brief errand to her sister's house, and she read it with the concentrated attention she brought to any document that mattered. She took no notes while she read. She had a very good memory, trained over years of needing to retain large amounts of information in situations where writing things down was not always possible, and she read the 8 pages from beginning to end, and then set them down and sat quietly for several minutes before reading them again. The facts, as Finch had assembled them, were as follows. Clara Hargrove had been acquainted with Richard for approximately 18 months. The connection had been formed at a shooting party in the early autumn of the previous year, hosted by a man named Gerald Ashby at his estate in Wiltshire. Gerald Ashby was known to both of them separately, which was how these connections often began, not through direct introduction, but through the overlapping of social territories that were adjacent without being identical. Clara had been invited by a mutual female acquaintance. Richard had been there as part of the regular country party that he attended with a group of men who had known each other since school. Finch had established through careful inquiry among various people with various connections that they had been in regular contact since the late autumn of the previous year, and that the nature of the contact had become apparent to certain observant parties, though not discussed openly, by the following spring. The Kensington property was registered under a company called Pemberton Estates Limited, which had been incorporated 14 months ago and which was connected, through 2 layers of corporate structure, to a personal investment account held by Richard at a private bank in the city. The property was a terrace house in a street that Evelyn knew by sight if not by name, in a neighborhood that was comfortable without being the kind of address that would attract attention from anyone in their immediate social circle. The arrangement had all the hallmarks of something that had been thought through with some care, and Evelyn noted this not with admiration, but with the specific, calm quality of recognition that comes when a pattern you suspected is confirmed. There was more. Finch had managed to obtain, through means he described with diplomatic vagueness as professional inquiry and which Evelyn did not press, copies of several letters exchanged between Richard and Clara over the course of the preceding year. The letters were not what she had expected, which had been something inflamed and theatrical, the kind of correspondence she associated with the particular kind of man who saw himself as the hero of a romantic drama. They were quieter than that, more domestic, in an odd way. They were the letters of 2 people who had settled into an ease with one another that takes time to develop, and reading them was an experience that Evelyn found more arresting than the financial documentation, not because they were more damaging legally, but because of what they revealed about the interior landscape of the man she had been married to for 11 years. He wrote to Clara about things he had never mentioned at home, small things, a book he was reading, a conversation he had had that interested him, a memory from his own past that had been prompted by something recent. He wrote about the weather and about a piece of music he had heard and about a dog that visited the park near the Kensington house and that he found amusing. He was, in those letters, a different version of himself than the one Evelyn had known. Or perhaps not different, perhaps the same, but unlocked. She read those letters with the steady, dispassionate attention of a woman who had already made her essential decision and did not need what she was reading to confirm it, and what she found in them was not fuel for anger but something more useful than anger: information. She had always believed that understanding a situation fully was more valuable than responding to it emotionally. Emotion was real, and she was not without it. There was, somewhere beneath the stillness she was maintaining, a very deep and quiet thing that she did not examine directly, but that she was aware of in the way you are aware of the foundation of a house without looking at it. But emotion without understanding was reactive, and reactive was not what she intended to be. She intended to be precise. And to be precise, she needed to understand not just what had happened, but the texture of it, the shape of it, the degree to which it was a considered ongoing choice, rather than a temporary disruption. The letters told her this. They told her it was considered and ongoing, and that it had developed the particular solidity that things develop when they have been sustained over time. Finch's report also included a section on finances that Evelyn found the most technically interesting, because numbers were a language she had always been comfortable in. Richard's personal financial position was more complex than the household accounts she managed suggested. There were accounts she had not known about, not because they had been concealed with any particular sophistication, but because she had never had reason to look for them. She had managed the estate accounts and the household accounts, which were the practical machinery of the life they lived together, and she had not looked further. She was looking further now. What she saw was a picture of a man whose financial decisions had become, over the past 2 years, increasingly organized around a life that ran parallel to the one he shared with her. Not dramatically so, not in a way that constituted ruin, but in a way that was deliberate, and that had direction. She closed the report and locked it in the lower drawer of her desk. Then she opened her blue notebook, the small plain one she had begun keeping 2 weeks after the first letter, and she wrote, in her smallest hand, a summary of the key points from Finch's report. Not verbatim, but the essential structure of what she now knew. She dated the entry. She noted the source. She closed the notebook and returned it to the drawer. She thought about what to do with Clara Hargrove. This was, in some ways, the most delicate question of the entire situation, and it was one she had been circling for several weeks without quite landing on a clear position. The easy answer, the one that most people in her position would have gravitated toward without much thought, was to treat Clara as an adversary, a woman who had entered her marriage and taken something that was, by the conventions of the arrangement, not hers to take. Evelyn understood this framing. She could see its emotional logic clearly. She simply did not find it useful, and she had spent enough of her life noticing the difference between what was emotionally logical and what was actually useful to trust that instinct. Clara Hargrove was a widow of modest means in a world that offered women of modest means a limited set of paths. She had found one that was not entirely respectable by the standards of the world they moved in, but that was also not entirely without its own human sense. She had not broken into a life that was already whole. She had entered a gap. That gap was not her creation. The gap had been there long before she arrived, made by the particular shape of a marriage that was a contract without being a companionship, and she had not created it by stepping into it. This was not a generous interpretation. It was an accurate one, and accurate interpretations were more useful than generous ones, because they did not require you to sustain an illusion about the person you were thinking about. What she was beginning to form, in those November weeks, was a plan that did not include Clara as an adversary at all. It included her, instead, as an element of the context, a person who would be present in a room at a time of Evelyn's choosing, because having her present served a specific purpose, not to diminish her, not to confront her, simply to establish, in a visible and entirely clear way, the full picture of what had been happening, and to do so at a moment when Richard would understand that the picture was now understood. This required an invitation. She would send one, in due course. First, however, there was another person she needed to consult. She wrote to Mr. George Prentice that week. Prentice was a barrister who practiced in chambers in Temple, and who had been recommended by Finch with the specific quality of recommendation that Finch reserved for people he trusted without qualification. She had asked Finch, at their initial meeting, whether he had anyone in mind for the legal aspect of what she was contemplating. He had written down one name. She had noted that he had not paused before writing it. The lack of pause was its own recommendation. She met Prentice on a Friday afternoon, at his chambers, arriving in a plain coat and hat and a cab rather than the West Haven carriage, because she was maintaining the habit of doing everything connected to this separately from the household. Prentice turned out to be a man in his mid-40s with a face that was not memorable in any specific way, but that had, in it, the quality of someone who had spent decades dealing with difficult things without being rattled by them. He had a legal pad. He had an uncapped pen. He had the specific quality of stillness that Finch also had, and she thought, not for the first time, that this must be something that either the law produced in its practitioners, or that caused people who already had it to choose the law. She told him what she knew and what she intended. She showed him the summary pages. He read them without comment and then looked up and asked his two questions. The first was about timing, and she told him about the dinner, the annual West Haven dinner, 6 weeks away, which she had been hosting for 11 years and which 40 guests would attend. He asked why that specific moment, and she explained the logic. Control of the space, control of the context, the presence of witnesses whose existence would ensure that Richard understood the nature of what was happening, without needing it spelled out. Prentice listened and wrote something on his pad. The second question was whether she was certain she wanted to proceed. She had expected this question. She had been asked it before, by herself, in the early morning hours of several recent nights, and she had answered it each time with the same answer. She looked at Prentice across the table and said, "I have been certain since October." He accepted this without elaboration. He uncapped his pen more firmly and asked her to tell him, in as much detail as she could, the financial structure of the marital estate as she understood it. She told him. It took 40 minutes. He asked 12 questions. She answered each one precisely, with dates and figures where she had them, and honest acknowledgement of gaps where she did not. When she was finished, he said he would need 2 to 3 weeks to review everything properly and prepare a draft of the relevant documents. She said that was acceptable. She stood, and he stood, and she put on her coat, and she thanked him, and he said that he would be in touch through the address she had given him. She went out into the gray November afternoon, where the trees on the temple embankment were entirely bare, and the river was dark, and the city moved around her with its usual, indifferent energy. She walked for a while before she found a cab, because she wanted the air and because she had found, over these weeks, that walking was one of the most useful things she could do when her mind was very active. It kept the body occupied so the mind could work without the body's restlessness interfering. She thought, as she walked, about the invitation. The dinner was in the 3rd week of December, and she needed to send the invitations within the week, because 40 people required reasonable notice. She already knew which 40. She knew which table she would put each one at, and which seat along the table would be assigned to Clara Hargrove, and which seat would be hers, and what the angle of sight lines across the table would mean for every person in the room at the relevant moment. She had been turning this over in her mind for long enough that the details had settled into a kind of clarity. She found a cab. She gave the address. She sat back against the seat and folded her hands in her lap and watched London move past the windows. And she thought about the dinner, and about the envelope she would carry in her evening bag, and about the particular quality of composure that she was going to be required to sustain for an entire evening, while knowing what she knew, and intending what she intended. She thought she could do it. She had been sustaining composure in difficult circumstances for 11 years. She had made it into something very like a second nature. One more evening was not beyond her. She was home in time for tea with the children. Caroline had made something at school that day using paint and paper and an ambitious quantity of glue, and she produced it at the tea table with the pride of a person presenting a significant work to an audience they trusted. Henry examined it with the seriousness he brought to all things, and said it looked like a flower, or possibly a horse. Caroline said it was a garden, and Henry said he could see that now, and Evelyn said she thought it was beautiful, and she meant it, and she asked whether she could put it on the mantelpiece in the morning room. Caroline said yes. It went on the mantelpiece that evening, and Evelyn looked at it before she went to bed, and thought about the particular fortune of having these two people in her life, and about how much she intended to protect that, which was not fortune at all but the one thing she had built in her adult life that was entirely and uncomplicatedly good. She went to her room. She read for an hour. She slept better than she had in weeks. The file that Mr. Finch placed on Evelyn's writing desk one gray Thursday morning in early December was not thick. It was barely an inch of papers, held together in a plain cardboard folder, with a label on the front that said, in Finch's small, careful handwriting, simply W. Full summary. He had not written her name on it, or the Duke's, because Finch was the kind of man who understood that the most important documents were always the ones that looked the least like anything at all. Evelyn opened it slowly, and read from the beginning. She already knew most of what was in it. She had been receiving pieces of this information for weeks, in the form of brief notes that Finch sent to her sister's London address, but seeing it assembled in full, in sequence, with each item cross-referenced and sourced with the precision that Finch brought to everything he did, had a different quality to it. It made the thing real in a way that individual pieces did not. It turned a collection of suspicions and partial truths into a document. And a document, Evelyn had learned from her father, was where things became serious. She read steadily for 40 minutes, making no marks on the pages, only reading. Then she set it down, closed the folder, and looked out the window at the garden, where the last of the autumn roses were still clinging, slightly ragged now, to the wall along the south side. She was quiet for a long time. The financial picture was the first thing she studied carefully. Richard's personal accounts, the ones Finch had tracked, told a story that was cleaner and more deliberate than she had been prepared for. There were regular transfers, modest in individual amount, but consistent enough in pattern and frequency to add up to something significant over 14 months. There was a layer of separation between the family estate accounts, which she managed, and the personal accounts where these transfers originated, and the separation had been constructed with enough care to suggest that whoever had helped Richard set it up, whether a financial advisor or simply his own caution, had understood the value of compartmentalization. She thought about compartmentalization for a while. She had always believed it was one of the most underrated disciplines of practical life, the ability to hold different things in different parts of your mind, without allowing them to blur into each other. She had practiced it herself for years, maintaining the composure of a duchess while also being the person who thought clearly in the early hours of the morning about the things that composure was required to conceal. The irony of admiring the same quality in the approach that had been used to deceive her was not lost on her, and she sat with it for a moment, because she always sat with the honest things rather than looking away from them. The second property was the detail that required the most thought. It was a small house in the countryside outside Oxford, purchased through a separate arrangement from the Kensington property, and Finch had only recently uncovered it. It had been acquired 18 months ago. The legal structure of the purchase placed it, technically, outside the marital estate, and the question of whether that technical separation would hold up to scrutiny was one she had sent to Prentice. His response had been measured, and in his measured response she had heard what she always heard in measured responses from people who knew their material. There was an argument, and the argument was worth making, and the outcome was not guaranteed but was not unreasonable. She put the folder away and locked the drawer. Then she sat very still for several minutes, not in distress but in the particular quality of quietness she entered when she was processing something that had many layers and required her to be patient with herself about how long the processing would take. She thought about honesty. It was the thing she valued most, in herself and in the people she chose to have near her, and she tried to apply it now, in the most demanding possible way, honestly. What had been done to her was a betrayal. Not a dramatic one, not operatic, not the kind of thing that makes good theater. It was quieter and more persistent than that. It was the betrayal of someone who had been consistent and reliable, and had made something work that was not easy to make work, by someone who had been allowed to be inconsistent and unreliable, and who had done it in comfort, and without apparent concern, that the comfort came at a significant cost to someone else. She did not hate Richard for it. She was not interested in hate, which she had always found an exhausting and unproductive emotion. What she felt was something colder and more useful, a very clear understanding of what the situation was, stripped of the accommodations she had been making to it for years. She had been telling herself for longer than she cared to acknowledge that the arrangement was workable, that the limitations were the limitations of all arrangements of this kind, that reasonable people accepted reasonable compromises and got on with things. She had believed this with a conviction that had served her well as a coping mechanism and had served her not at all as an accurate description of what was actually happening. What had actually been happening was this. She had been holding up one side of an arrangement with both hands, while the person who was supposed to be holding the other side had simply walked away from his end, quietly and without telling her, and had been standing across the room watching her continue to hold it up, and finding it convenient that she did. She took a breath. She opened the drawer again and took out the blue notebook and turned to a fresh page. She wrote, very carefully, the full list of what she was going to need before she could act. The documentation was largely complete. The legal framework was being built by Prentice. The financial review was done. The plan for the occasion was formed. What remained was the writing of the letter, which she had been constructing in her head for weeks, but had not yet committed to paper, because she was the kind of person who did not write important things until she was certain of every word. She began drafting it that afternoon. She wrote it in the same notebook, in the knowledge that she would transfer the final version to the cream paper when she was satisfied. She wrote slowly, and with great attention, because the letter was the fulcrum of everything, the single piece of the plan that most needed to be exactly right. It could not be emotional, that was her first requirement of it. Not cold, not cruel, but precise, and clear, and entirely without the kind of language that could be characterized as dramatic, or excessive, or designed to wound. She was not trying to wound. She was trying to resolve. The letter needed to reflect that. She wrote and crossed out and rewrote for the better part of 3 hours, and by the end of the afternoon she had something she thought was close. She would come back to it the next morning and read it fresh, because fresh eyes on important documents had saved her from errors more times than she could count. She put the notebook away and went to find the children. who were with their nurse upstairs and who received her arrival with the enthusiasm that children bring to parental visits that are slightly unexpected. As if a mother who appears in the nursery in the afternoon rather than at the scheduled time is a special edition of herself. She spent an hour with them. She helped Henry, who had made considerable progress on the suspension bridge, understand why the proportional relationship between the towers and the span mattered for the structural logic. She read with Caroline, who was working through a book that was slightly too advanced for her technically, but not at all too advanced in terms of her interest, which Evelyn had always believed was the better indicator of what a child should be reading. She went back to her desk that evening and added 2 more items to the list in the notebook. She had thought of them during bath time, which was often when she thought of things that had been sitting in the background of her mind while she was occupied with something else. This was one of the things she had noticed about herself over many years, that the most useful thinking she did happened in the peripheral hours, in the spaces between attention, while she was doing something entirely ordinary that freed the deeper processes to work without interruption. The letter would be done by the end of the week, the invitations would go out within days, and when they were out, and when Prentice had confirmed the final documents, and when Finch had filed the last of the records that needed filing, the preparation would be complete, and then there would be nothing left to do but wait for the evening, and carry it out, and begin whatever came next. She closed the notebook. She said goodnight to the children, who were being put to bed by their nurse. She went to her own room and read for a while the history of an expedition to the Arctic that she had been finding absorbing for a week, and she thought it was appropriate that she was reading about people who prepared extremely carefully for something difficult and then set out into it without any guarantee of what they would find on the other side. She put the book down and turned off the lamp. Outside, the autumn night was cool and still, and the garden below her window was dark, and she lay in the darkness and felt, for the first time in months, the specific lightness that comes when the work of a very large thing has been done, and only the doing of it remains. She was ready, or very nearly, and nearly was close enough, for now. She had always known, in some version of the knowledge that does not quite become conscious until it is needed, that there would come a moment in her life when the things she had most carefully kept apart from herself, the full, honest reckoning with the nature of the life she was living, would need to be faced directly. Most people she knew had such a moment and found ways to continue not facing it. She had always suspected she was not among that group. She had suspected she was the kind of person who, when the moment came, would look at it. The thing she found, when she looked at it, was not devastation. She had been prepared for devastation and had arranged in the architecture of the preceding months a series of practical bulwarks against it. The documentation, the legal preparation, the financial planning, the careful building of what would come next. What she found instead of devastation was something more structural than that. A very clear, very still understanding of the distance between the life she had been living and the life that was possible, and a very specific desire to cross that distance. The desire was not dramatic. It was not the fizzing, unreliable longing that she associated with things people chose impulsively and later reconsidered. It was the steady, durable desire of someone who has thought about a thing for a long time and is certain about it, and whose certainty is made of the same material as all her other certainties: evidence, examination, and the particular clarity that comes from being completely honest with yourself about what you know. She was 40 years old. She had given the better part of her adult life to a marriage that had been conducted in good faith by only one of the two parties. She was not going to give the rest of it to the same arrangement. Not because she was bitter, or angry, or even especially unhappy in the ordinary sense of the word, but because she had looked at the distance between where she was and where she was capable of being, and the distance was too large to ignore. She was too young to accept a life defined by what it lacked, and she was too competent not to do something about it. That was the cleanest form she could give to the decision. She was too competent not to do something about it. Her father would have approved of that formulation. He had always said that intelligence without action was merely elaborate regret, and she had thought him overstated when she was young and had come, over the years, to think him precisely right. By the following Monday, the letter was finished. She had come back to it on Saturday morning and read it with the cold, dispassionate attention she gave to all documents she was about to finalize, and she had found 2 sentences that needed adjustment and 1 paragraph that needed to be shortened by a third. And she had made the changes and read it again, and it was right. She knew when things were right, in the same way she knew when the accounts were correct. There was a particular quality of fit that you either felt or didn't, and it was not mystical. It was simply the result of knowing your material well enough to recognize when it had found its proper form. She wrote the final version on plain cream paper on Monday morning, in her smallest and most careful hand, working slowly so that nothing was misread and nothing was crossed out. When she finished, she read it one last time. Then she folded it into thirds, sealed it in an envelope, and addressed it to Richard in handwriting that was impeccably neat and entirely unreadable in terms of what it contained. She placed the envelope in the locked drawer with everything else, in the folder marked simply W in her own notation. She then turned to the invitations, 40 of them, as she had said to Prentice, on the cream notepaper with the West Haven crest. She had done this every year for 11 years, and she knew the list as well as she knew the rooms of the house. She wrote them by hand, all 40, in 2 evenings because her wrist was not equal to 40 invitations in a single sitting. She wrote them in the order she always wrote them, beginning with the connections of longest standing and working outward. Clara Hargrove's invitation was the 37th, written on the second evening, and she wrote it with the same hand she wrote all the others, and the same warmth of phrasing. And when she sealed it with the same small brass seal she used for all formal correspondence. She posted them the following morning in 2 batches, the second of which included Clara Hargrove's. The weeks that followed were the weeks of waiting. Not passive waiting, because she was not a person capable of passivity, and there was a great deal to manage in the practical preparation for the dinner. But beneath all of it was the specific quality of readiness held in suspension, the feeling of a thing wound tightly and waiting to be released. She had felt it before, though rarely. She felt it now at a level of intensity she had not previously encountered. She did not find it unpleasant. She found it clarifying. Every morning when she sat at her writing desk and reviewed the day, she was aware of it underneath the ordinary agenda of the household, and it had the quality of a compass pointing in a single direction, forward, toward the evening in the 3rd week of December, toward the 40 guests and the 7 courses and the long table with its candles and the envelope she was going to carry in her evening bag. She was, she thought, the most prepared person she had ever been for anything, and preparation had always been, for her, the closest thing she knew to courage. The invitation she sent to Clara Hargrove was written on the same cream notepaper she used for all of her social correspondence, with the West Haven crest at the top, in the same hand she used for everything. She worded it warmly, as she would word any invitation to an acquaintance, with the particular quality of welcome that Evelyn brought to all of her social correspondence, because she had always believed that a letter of invitation should make the person feel genuinely wanted, regardless of the complications underneath. She did not allow her pen to slow or hesitate at any point while writing it. She heard back from 36 of the 40 invitations within 10 days, which was a good return by the standards of December correspondence. Clara Hargrove's response arrived on the 14th day, folded inside a small envelope addressed in a hand that was careful and clear, the writing of someone who had been taught to take the presentation of words seriously. The note accepted the invitation with the appropriate mixture of gratitude and pleasure. It was perfectly pitched for the occasion. Evelyn filed it with the others. Dorothy Beaumont, Evelyn's closest and oldest friend, came for tea in the 2nd week of December and mentioned, with the directness that Evelyn valued above almost all of her other qualities, that she had heard Clara Hargrove would be at the dinner. She mentioned it with the tone of someone who is asking a question without formulating it as one. Evelyn poured tea and said yes, she had extended an invitation and was glad it had been accepted, because she thought it would be a good gathering, and she wanted the table to be interesting. Dorothy looked at her across the rim of her teacup with the particular quality of attention she had, an attention that had always, in their long friendship, been the thing Evelyn valued most and found most difficult to manage at the same time. "You seem very organized lately," Dorothy said. "I am always organized," Evelyn said, which was true, and also not an answer to what Dorothy was actually saying, and both of them knew it. Dorothy accepted it, because she had known Evelyn for 20 years, and understood that there were certain territories you entered only when you were invited, and she had not been invited yet. The dinner preparations were, on the surface, identical to every other year's. Evelyn reviewed the menu with Mrs. Parton, who had been the West Haven cook for 9 years, and who was, in her domain, exactly what Evelyn was in hers, competent, organized, and unruffled by complexity. They agreed on 7 courses, the last 2 of which required a preparation time that meant certain elements needed to begin 3 days before the dinner. Mrs. Parton said she would manage it. Evelyn said she had no doubt. She reviewed the wine with Mr. Graves, who had been the West Haven butler for 22 years, and who she trusted with her life, or close to it, and who had the specific quality that the best household managers have, the ability to see what needs doing, and do it without requiring it to be explained. She reviewed the linen and the silver, both of which required attention that she gave personally, because these were the details that guests felt without knowing they felt them, and the feeling of a dinner was constructed from exactly these invisible particulars. And then she sat down with the seating plan. She had been thinking about the seating plan since October. Not obsessively, because the seating plan had been one concern among many, each of which had received the proper proportion of her attention, but it had been turning in the background, a quiet problem among the louder ones, working itself toward its own solution in the way that problems do when you have enough information about them and enough time. The plan that emerged was this. She placed herself at the center of the long table, on the south side, which was the side from which she could see the full length of the room and both ends of the table. She placed Richard at the head, which was traditional and appropriate, and gave him the authority over the appearance of the occasion that his position required. She placed Clara Hargrove 7 seats along on Richard's side of the table, between a retired judge named Sir Philip Crane and a woman from the charity committee who was engaging and thoughtful, and would ensure that Clara had good conversation throughout the evening. The placement was visible from Evelyn's position. It was also, if anyone thought to analyze it carefully, precisely calculated in every detail. Dorothy was placed 3 seats to Evelyn's right, not because Evelyn intended to need her, but because Dorothy was the anchor, and an anchor should be close. She wrote the place cards herself, in her smallest and most precise hand, on the ivory stock, 40 names. She laid them out on the desk afterward and looked at them for a moment. 40 small cards representing 40 people who would spend an evening in a room that was going to contain, unbeknownst to 38 of them, something quite significant. She put them in a box and took them to the dining room and set them aside for Mr. Graves to place on the evening. The week before the dinner, she received the revised documents from Prentice. He had incorporated the 2 amendments she had requested, and he had added a third, which he explained in a covering note. She read the full draft twice and then wrote back with one final question about the Oxford property. He answered within 48 hours with the response she had been waiting for. The argument for including it in the settlement was solid, and he was prepared to make it, and she told him to proceed. She then did a thing that she had been thinking about for several weeks. She wrote to an estate agent in Edinburgh. She had visited Edinburgh twice in recent years and had found, on both occasions, that she liked the city in a way she had not expected. There was something in the quality of its light, and in the weight and solidity of its streets, and in the character of a place that took its own seriousness seriously, that suited her. She had looked, on the second visit, at the neighborhood around the new town, and she had thought something she had not said to anyone. I could live here. The letter asked about availability of properties of a particular size and with particular practical features, in a price range that corresponded to what she could manage independently, because she did not want to buy this house with contested money. She wanted to buy it with her own. She received 4 particulars within the week and reviewed them carefully. One was exactly what she had in mind. She made an appointment for the following week. She went to Edinburgh on the Tuesday before the dinner, on the morning train, viewed the property with the agent, and made an offer before she left. She was back in London that evening. She told no one. The offer was accepted on the morning of the dinner, which she received by telegram at 7 in the morning, and read while at her writing desk before the household had fully come alive. She put the telegram in the same drawer as everything else. She locked it. Then she went downstairs. The dining room that morning had the quality it always had on the day of a dinner. A room that had been brought to a peak of readiness and that now waited. The silver on the table caught the winter light from the windows. The flowers, arranged in tall arrangements that would not obstruct sight lines across the table, were white and deeply green. She walked the length of the table once and checked each place setting and found nothing that needed correction, which gave her a small, clean satisfaction. She spoke to Mrs. Parton about the timing of the courses. She spoke to Mr. Graves about the wines and about the moment at which she would like the second course held back slightly. She confirmed the positioning of the additional staff they had brought in for the evening. She reviewed the arrangement of the drawing room and made a single small adjustment to the position of a chair near the fireplace. Then she went upstairs to the children. She had not told them anything yet. She would not tonight, not until the situation had been properly resolved and she knew precisely what she was telling them, and in exactly what words. But she visited them in the nursery for the better part of an hour, sitting in the low chair near the window while Henry showed her the improvements he had made to the suspension bridge and Caroline read aloud from the book she had brought home from school. She was entirely present in that hour, every part of her attention given to them. When she left, she kissed them both and told Caroline that her reading was beautiful, and told Henry that the bridge's structural logic was sound but that the towers might benefit from a wider base, which he found enormously satisfying. She went to her room to dress. The dark green silk was hanging where Agnes had pressed it. Agnes helped her dress without unnecessary conversation, which was one of the things Evelyn valued about her. She finished with the emerald earrings that had been her grandmother's. She looked at herself in the glass when Agnes had finished. She looked like herself. She thought that was correct. She went through the guest list one final time on the afternoon before the dinner. not because it needed checking, but because she always went through plans one final time before executing them, as her father had gone through briefs the evening before a hearing. It was a habit. It served a purpose. It revealed nothing that needed to be changed, which was the ideal outcome for any final check, because it meant the preparation had been sufficient, she noted, going through the list, the particular geometry of the evening as she had constructed it. 40 people, 7 courses, a table 38 feet long with candles at precise intervals. Every person placed according to a calculation that was simultaneously social, personal, and strategic, in a way that none of the 40 were aware of, and that none of them needed to be aware of. This was the particular kind of architecture that she had been building for 11 years, without ever identifying it as architecture. The creation of spaces in which things could happen, and conversations could move, and people could be at their best, and the whole complex ecology of a dinner for 40 could function with the appearance of naturalness. She had been very good at it. She intended this evening to be the finest expression of that skill she had ever produced, not because she needed the validation of the skill, but because she believed in doing things as well as they could be done at the moment of doing them. And this was going to be the last time she did this in this house in this role, and that made it worthy of her best effort. There was a small piece of pleasure in that thought, underneath everything else. The pleasure of mastery, the pleasure of being very good at something and knowing it. She had felt it before, in particular moments of the work of the estates, or in an especially well-managed committee meeting, or in those rare occasions when she had been in conversation with someone truly interesting, and had felt the particular energy of 2 minds working at the same level. She allowed herself to feel it now, because it was honest, and because it was hers, and she was done, or nearly done, with the habit of not acknowledging what was hers. She put the list away. She had the house to manage. She would manage it. The afternoon was spent in the particular productive efficiency of a house, preparing itself for something. Mrs. Parton was in the kitchen from early morning. Mr. Graves was managing the wine cellar and the arrangements for the additional service staff. Agnes was attending to the details of Evelyn's own preparation with the thoroughness she always brought to important occasions. And Evelyn moved through all of it, checking and confirming and making the 1 or 2 adjustments that always needed making no matter how well everything had been prepared. Because perfection is always 1 degree beyond preparation, and the last degree is always found only when you are standing inside the thing itself. The envelope, sealed and addressed, was already inside her evening bag, which Agnes had placed on the chair beside the dressing table. Evelyn picked it up and felt the small, flat weight of it against the silk lining, and then she went downstairs to receive her guests. The first carriage arrived at 29 minutes past 7, belonging to the Harrington Wilkes, a couple in their 60s who were always slightly early for everything, and who had been coming to the Westhaven dinner for as long as it had existed. Evelyn greeted them in the entrance hall with the warmth she had for people she had known for a long time, asked after their daughter who had recently had a second baby, and listened to the answer with genuine interest, and then directed them toward the drawing room where Mr. Graves had opened the champagne, and where the fire was burning with the quality of warmth that Evelyn had asked be achieved before the first guest arrived. After that they came steadily, in the way that people come to a well-organized dinner when they have been given a clear arrival time, not quite all at once, but close enough that the drawing room filled with the particular warm, layered sound of 40 people who were pleased to see each other, and who were also pleased to be in this house, which was one of the things Evelyn had always been proudest of. She had made this house a place that people were glad to come to, and the gladness was real, and she had built it herself, over 11 years, out of specific knowledge of people and specific attention to detail. She stood near the fireplace and greeted each person as they arrived, and she gave each person the complete, focused quality of attention that was the thing people remembered most about a conversation with her. She asked the retired judge about the memoir he had mentioned writing. She asked a woman from her charity committee about her mother's health, which had been uncertain in the autumn. She listened to a friend of Richard's, a man who went by the name Skip, describe his recent journey to India for as long as he wanted to describe it, which was a considerable time. She was watching the door throughout all of this. Not obviously. She had never been obvious about anything, but she was watching. Clara Hargrove arrived at 8 minutes to 8. She came with a woman named Mrs. Charlotte Arnold, whom Evelyn knew slightly, and she was wearing a dress of deep ivory that suited her without being ostentatious. At close range, she was exactly as she had appeared at a distance, agreeable and composed and possessed of the quality of warmth that Evelyn had noted before. She greeted Evelyn with a smile that was genuine in its pleasure and slightly uncertain in its foundation. The smile of a person who is glad to be somewhere, and not entirely sure why they have been invited. Evelyn welcomed her with the same warmth she had used for the Harrington Wilkes, and asked whether she had been to the Westhaven house before, and when Clara said she had not, Evelyn said she must tell her a little of its history later in the evening. Clara said she would like that very much. Mrs. Arnold said something pleasant. Evelyn responded in kind, and Clara moved into the drawing room and was absorbed into the gathering, and Evelyn turned to greet the next arrival. Dorothy Beaumont pressed Evelyn's hand when she came in and said, very quietly, "You look entirely yourself," which was the most specific and accurate thing Dorothy could have said, and which told Evelyn that Dorothy knew, on some level she had not articulated even to herself, that the evening was going to be something. Richard came downstairs at 8:04, later than it should have been, and said he apologized for the lateness. He moved through the gathering with the ease of a man who had been doing this all his life. He worked his way through the room with a rhythm that was recognizable to Evelyn from 11 years of watching it. She tracked him, without appearing to track him, from her position near the fireplace. She saw the moment when he reached the part of the room where Clara was standing. She saw the brief, invisible recalibration, the adjustment that happened somewhere in his expression in the fraction of a second between seeing her and greeting her. He greeted Clara with exactly the right amount of friendly casualness, not enough to draw attention. He was good at this. Evelyn had always known that. He did not look toward his wife. At 8:30, Mr. Graves announced dinner. The 40 guests moved through in the pleasant, slightly shuffled stream that always happened at this moment, people finding each other and separating again as they located their seats. Evelyn came through last, as she always did, because the hostess should enter the dining room after the guests. She stood at the threshold for a moment. The dining room was lit entirely by candles, 42 of them in the 2 candelabras and the 8 candlesticks along the table, and the light they made was the particular, irreplaceable light of a room being used for the purpose it was designed for. The guests were finding their places, reading the small ivory cards with their names, settling. She saw Clara find her seat, 7 positions from Richard's end, between Sir Philip and the woman from the charity committee. She saw the charity committee woman say something to Clara immediately, in the friendly, efficient way of someone who has decided to be hospitable before being told to. She saw Richard, already seated at the head, look along the length of the table and find Clara, and then find Evelyn. The distance between them was the full length of the table. The candles were between them. She held his gaze for the exact length of time that was appropriate for a wife acknowledging her husband across a dinner table, perhaps 2 seconds, and then she moved to her own seat. She sat. She unfolded her napkin. She accepted water. She turned to the man on her left, a writer of some distinction who was working on a book about cartography, and who she had placed beside herself because she was genuinely curious about his work, and she asked him a question that showed she had done some reading. He was immediately engaged. The first course arrived. The evening unfolded with the smooth, well-managed ease of all of her dinners, which is to say that it had the appearance of effortlessness, while being the product of a very great deal of effort. The soup was excellent. The fish course was precisely what it should be. The conversation around her end of the table ranged widely and well. She was present for all of it, genuinely present, because she had always been a person who could not be in a room without being fully in it, even when the room contained many other things she was simultaneously managing. She noted, without appearing to note, the texture of the evening at Richard's end of the table. He was performing his host function with his usual competence. Clara was having, by all visible indications, a pleasant time. Sir Philip, who was an engaging and experienced dinner companion, was clearly enjoying himself. The charity committee woman was exactly as useful as Evelyn had predicted she would be. The table was working. It was working because she had made it work, and she allowed herself the small, private acknowledgement of that fact. Somewhere after the fish course and before the main course, she became aware that the evening had reached a particular quality of momentum. This was something she had noticed before. At dinners she had managed well, where a gathering finds its level, and stops needing to be managed and simply runs itself, carried by the energy of the people in it. The West Haven autumn dinner had reached that point, and she felt it, and she felt also that this was the correct moment, not only in the practical sense of timing, but in the deeper sense of rightness that she had always trusted more than she could explain. The envelope was in her evening bag, hanging on the back of her chair. She was aware of it throughout the evening in the way you are aware of something important that is waiting in a specific place, not obsessively, but constantly, with the background attentiveness of preparation. She ate, and talked, and listened, and laughed once at something genuinely funny the retired judge said, which carried down to her end of the table. She signaled to Graves when she thought the next course could come in. She was, from every observable angle, exactly what she had always been. The evening had, underneath its surface of managed perfection, a quality that she would not have expected, which was the quality of being fully real. She had thought, preparing for it over so many weeks, that the evening itself would feel slightly unreal, the way that long-anticipated things sometimes do when they finally arrive, and the anticipation has built around them a framework that the reality cannot quite fill. What she found instead was that the reality was entirely present, entirely itself, more specific and more vivid than the version she had been carrying in her mind. The room smelled of the flowers and the candles, and the food coming from the kitchen, and the particular atmospheric combination of 40 people in good clothes, who are glad to be where they are. This was the room she had created over 11 years, and she was in it. And she was doing the last thing she was going to do in it in this form, and it was entirely real. She thought, between the second and third courses, about her father again. About the way he had described the moment before the opening of a case, when all the preparation was complete, and there was nothing left to do but stand up and begin. He had described it as the cleanest moment of the work, because everything before it was building toward something, and everything after it was the thing itself. And the brief, still space between them had a quality that was difficult to name, but that experienced practitioners recognize as the signature of sufficient preparation. She had not understood what he meant when she was young. She understood it now, at 38 feet of candlelit table with the fish course being cleared, and the door to what came next standing directly in front of her. She was ready. She had always known she would be ready. She had simply not known until now what being ready would feel like from the inside. It felt like this, entirely and precisely like this. She signaled to Graves that the third course could be cleared. She turned to the man on her left and asked him the question she had been saving, because she had found, over 11 years of dinner parties, that the best questions to ask were the ones that genuinely interested you, because genuine interest produced genuine response. And genuine response produced the particular pleasure of a conversation that has arrived somewhere neither person expected. Between the third and fourth courses, when the plates from the fish had been cleared and there was a pause before the meat arrived, Evelyn placed her hand on the edge of the table and rose. This was not unusual. The hostess at a dinner of this kind sometimes moved during the meal, attending to the needs of the table. Several people noticed and thought nothing of it. She moved along the back of the chairs on her side of the table, behind 4 guests without interrupting their conversations, and came around the foot to the opposite side. Then she walked along Richard's side of the table until she was directly behind his chair. He was in the middle of a sentence, talking to the man on his left about something to do with an estate management conference he had attended in autumn. He sensed her presence before he saw her, in the way that people always sense it when someone comes to stand directly behind them, and he turned slightly in his chair. She leaned down, just slightly, and placed the envelope on the table beside his right hand, on the white cloth, where it lay flat and cream and entirely still. She was close enough to speak without raising her voice above the level of the surrounding conversation, and she said, in a tone from which all inflection that could be interpreted as anything in particular had been removed, "You will want to read that before the evening is over. There is no urgency, but there is no alternative either." She straightened up. She turned. She walked back along the table, past 4 guests who were in the middle of their own conversations, and sat down at her own place. She picked up her napkin. She turned to Dorothy on her right and asked her how the play she had seen last week compared to the reviews she had read in advance of it. Dorothy looked at her for one fraction of a second that contained, in compressed form, a very large question. Then she answered the question about the play, and Evelyn listened to the answer with the full quality of attention she had given everything that evening, and the 4th course arrived, and the dinner continued. She did not look at Richard for the remainder of the meal. The envelope sat on the table beside his right hand. Nobody else appeared to notice it, which was not surprising since it was a cream envelope on a white tablecloth in a candlelit room, and the people around Richard were occupied with their own conversations. Richard himself did not touch it during the meal. She noticed this in her peripheral vision without looking at him directly. He was making a choice about when to pick it up. That meant he knew what category of thing it was, and he was deciding to face it alone rather than in a room full of people. That was, she thought, the rational thing to do, and it confirmed something she had always known about him. He was capable of the right response when he could see clearly what the right response was. The remaining courses came and went. The main course, the slow-roasted lamb that Mrs. Parton did extraordinarily well, was received exactly as it always was. The wine was poured and appreciated. Conversations crossed and doubled back in the way they do when 40 people have been well fed and well seated. Evelyn held her end of the table together with her usual quiet competence, and she was present for every conversation she was part of, and she laughed twice more at things that were genuinely funny, and she made sure that every person at her end of the table left it feeling that they had been given something of value that evening. Attention, interest, the particular pleasure of being in a room where a clever and organized mind had been at work in their favor. The dessert was the best she had ever served. She noticed this as she tasted it, with the cool, professional appreciation she brought to everything Mrs. Parton produced, and she made a mental note to tell her so in the morning. After the dessert, when the guests had moved back through to the drawing room for coffee, Evelyn stood near the tall windows looking out at the dark garden. She held her empty coffee cup and allowed herself, for the first time all evening, to feel what she actually felt. Not triumph. She had not expected triumph, and it had not arrived. What was there was something quieter than that and considerably more durable. It was the feeling of having done the thing she had decided to do, carried out exactly as she had planned it, without any departure from the preparation. It was the feeling of a plan that had run cleanly to its conclusion, and that particular feeling was something she did not have a simple word for, but that she recognized as close to the best thing her particular nature was capable of experiencing. Richard found her there, about 20 minutes after the guests had moved through. He came across the room toward her with a specific quality of intention in his walk, not the loose, social walk of a man moving through his own drawing room, but something more deliberate. She turned to face him before he arrived, so that when he reached her, they were face to face. He said her name, quietly, once. She looked at him and saw what was in his face. It was not anger. She had expected anger, at least initially, and had prepared for it. It was not shock either, not entirely. It was something closer to the expression of a man who has realized, completely and without any remaining room for doubt, that the landscape he thought he understood has shifted beneath his feet, and that there is no version of the next few minutes in which it shifts back. Not tonight, she said. Her voice was quiet and perfectly even. There are people here. Read it all, and speak to your solicitor, and when you are ready to have a proper conversation, I will be ready to have one. He said nothing. She took her coffee cup to the side table, set it down, and went back to her guests. She saw the last guest out at 5 minutes past 11. When the door was finally closed and the entrance hall was quiet, she thanked Mr. Graves for everything, complimented the service, and said that the clearing could wait until morning. He said he would see to the essentials and leave the rest. She climbed the stairs and checked on the children, who were both deeply asleep. She stood for a moment in Henry's doorway, and then in Caroline's, in the particular quality of nighttime looking that parents know, and she felt, in those 2 moments, what she always felt when looking at sleeping children. A love so straightforward and complete, that it required nothing from her except to be present. She went to her own room. She sat at the small writing table. She took off the earrings and put them in their case. She looked out at the dark garden for a long time. She was not particularly tired, which surprised her. She had expected exhaustion after the sustained effort of managing the evening so precisely. Instead, she felt clear, light, almost, in the particular way that things feel light when they have been put down after a long time of carrying them. She had done it, every part of it, exactly as she had planned. She had thought, in the weeks of preparation, about what would happen after the envelope was placed. She had run the scenario through her mind many times, because running scenarios was how she tested plans, imagining the range of possible responses and preparing, not necessarily for each one, but for the space between them, the space in which anything might happen, and in which composure was the only truly useful thing to have. She had prepared for anger, because anger was the most obvious first response of a person confronted with something they would rather not be confronted with. She had prepared for silence, because some people go silent when something large lands, and silence from the person across the table from you requires a different quality of management than words. She had prepared for denial, which was a form of anger. She had prepared for the thing she had actually received, which was the brief, contained, entirely rational response of a man who had read the document in the letter, and understood it, and was choosing, correctly, to deal with it privately rather than in a room full of people. What she had not fully prepared for, because it was not the kind of thing you can fully prepare for, was the specific quality of the walk back to her seat. The approximately 40 feet of dining room floor that she covered in the 20 seconds between placing the envelope and returning to her chair. She had planned it practically, thinking about it in terms of the physical path and the people she would pass and the angle at which she would need to move to avoid disrupting any of the conversations on her side of the table. What she had not planned was what it would feel like inside those 20 seconds. What it felt like was finished. Not in the sense of ending, but in the sense of completion. Something that had been in progress was now complete. The preparation was complete. The action was complete. The years of holding up one side of an arrangement while watching, increasingly clearly, that the other side was not being held, were complete. She walked back to her seat with the same steady pace she had always walked through this room, and she sat down, and she picked up her napkin, and she asked Dorothy about the play, and she was simultaneously entirely in the present moment, and absolutely permanently done with a particular version of the past. She would remember that walk for the rest of her life. Not the drama of it, because there had been no drama, but the specific quality of those 20 seconds, the feel of the floor under her shoes and the sound of 40 conversations continuing around her, and the candlelight steady at its intervals, and the envelope no longer in her bag but on the table beside his hand where it needed to be. She would remember those 20 seconds as the moment in which she understood, with total clarity, what she had been preparing for, and what she had achieved. The dinner had been the preparation's delivery. The walk was its confirmation. She reached her chair. She sat. She was composed. She was ready for whatever came next. She turned to Dorothy. "How did the play compare to what you'd expected from the reviews?" she said. Dorothy looked at her for a fraction of a second that contained, as Dorothy's looks always did, an enormous amount of unspoken understanding. Then Dorothy answered the question, and Evelyn listened, and the dinner continued. She went to bed. She slept for 7 hours without waking. In the morning, Richard was already gone when she came down. He had left for his club, Mr. Graves said, before 8. She thanked him and asked for her breakfast and spent the morning with the children. The note from Richard arrived at 2 in the afternoon, by messenger from his club. It said he would like to meet. It said he had read the letter. It said nothing else, because a man who has read a document like the one she had placed beside his hand knows that the next communication should be brief, because anything elaborate is either an argument he has not yet thought through, or a performance he has not yet decided on, and either one should wait for the meeting. She wrote back within the hour. Yes, the morning room, 10 o'clock tomorrow morning, please come alone, and she would do the same. She sealed the note and gave it to Mr. Graves for return delivery. Then she went to her writing desk and took out the notebook. She opened it to a fresh page and wrote the date at the top. Beneath the date she wrote in her smallest hand, the 2 words she had been waiting to write for 3 months. It's done. She looked at those words for a moment. Then she turned the page and began the list of next steps, which was long and which covered financial, legal, domestic, and personal matters in the precise order she always worked in. The list ran to 2 pages. She reviewed it when it was complete, added 3 items she had not initially thought of, and put it away. She poured herself a glass of water and sat for a moment in the particular quality of stillness that follows the completion of something that has required a very great deal of sustained effort. It was not the stillness of emptiness. It was the stillness of a system that has been running at high intensity and has just been allowed to slow. In the morning, she dressed without ceremony and went down to the morning room at 9:45. She asked for tea to be brought. She sat in her usual chair with a notepad and pen on the table beside her, not because she expected to take notes but because having them there was a habit she maintained at any meeting that mattered. When Richard came in at exactly 10 o'clock, which was unusual for him, and which she noticed, she looked up and said, "Thank you for coming. Please sit down." He sat. He looked like a man who had not slept very much. There were things in his face she had not seen there before, or perhaps had seen and ignored over the years. A tiredness that went beyond the night, a slightly diminished quality to the ease that had always been one of his dominant characteristics. He was not, in this moment, the Duke of Westhaven in the confident sense that he usually inhabited that role. He was a man who had read a letter and had spent the night understanding what it meant. "I want to have this conversation once," Evelyn said, clearly and without going around in circles. "I have no interest in a prolonged process." He said her name, as though he were going to follow it with something, and then stopped. She waited. She had all the time required. After a moment, "How long have you known?" She said, "I received the initial letter in October. I began the investigation in October. I had the full picture by November." He was quiet. Then, "And you said nothing." "I was preparing," she said. "Saying something while I was preparing would have been counterproductive." He received this. He said after a pause, "Are you certain you want to proceed?" She had been asked that question before by Prentice, and before that by herself many times in the early morning hours. The answer had not changed. "I have been certain," she said, "since October." Then she told him, in the order she had decided, what she knew, and how she had come to know it. She told him about Finch and about Prentice. She told him about the petition and the settlement terms she was proposing, which Prentice had confirmed were reasonable by any fair measure. She told him about the Oxford cottage, and she watched his face when she said this, and saw the small, involuntary tightening that told her Finch had been right to pursue it. And then she told him what she wanted for the children, because that was the part that mattered most, and she wanted it said first among the things that needed to be agreed. She spoke without emphasis, without heat, without any of the performance of emotion that he might have expected and been prepared for. She had always believed that the strongest position in any negotiation was the one held by the person who had no need to perform. Her position was not dependent on his response. The documents existed. The documentation existed. The preparation was complete. There was nothing he could say that changed any of it, and both of them were aware of this. When she finished, he was quiet for a long time. She waited. He said, "The children, you've thought about what this means for them." "I've thought of nothing else. From the beginning," she said. "The arrangement I'm proposing gives you regular and meaningful access. Real access, not symbolic. They are your children. That does not change." He looked at her. Then he said, "I didn't expect any of this." She said, "I know." He said, "I'll speak to a solicitor." She said, "Of course. I'd suggest you do that soon. The holidays are approaching and I would rather not have this extend into the new year." He looked at her for another moment, with something in his expression that she could not quite name. Not hostility. Not guilt exactly, or not only guilt. Something almost like recognition. As if he were seeing, perhaps for the first time in a long time, the person he had actually been married to all these years. He said, "The dinner, the invitation to Clara, was that planned from the beginning?" She said, "I planned a great deal of things from the beginning." He turned away and opened the door and went out. She heard his footsteps in the hall, and then the sound of the front door, and then the house was quiet. She sat back in her chair. She poured more tea from the pot that had gone slightly cool. She picked up the notepad and turned to a fresh page and wrote at the top, "Next steps." Then she began the list, which was long and specific, and which she worked through methodically, as she worked through everything. She wrote Henry and Caroline at the top and underlined it. She had expected the meeting to be harder than it was, not emotionally harder, because she had made her peace with the emotional dimension of it weeks ago, but harder in the sense of more contested, more resistant, more requiring of her to hold a position against pressure. What she found instead was a meeting between two people who were both, for different reasons, done. Richard was done in the way of a man who has understood that the ground beneath his feet is not what he thought it was, and is processing the implications. She was done in the way of a woman who has completed a very large piece of work and is already, in some part of herself, on the other side of it. The conversation had the quality, oddly, of something settling rather than breaking apart. She had thought there would be more jagged edges. There were some. The Oxford cottage was a jagged edge. The question of what would happen to certain household staff whose positions were tied to the Westhaven estate in ways that were technically Richard's concern but that she had been managing for years was a jagged edge. The financial question of the transition period before the legal settlement was complete was a jagged edge. But the larger conversation, the conversation about what the marriage had been, and what they were choosing now, was strangely smooth, as if they had both been building toward this point for longer than either of them had admitted. She thought about that smoothness afterward, sitting at her writing desk with the conversation finished and the morning around her continuing in its ordinary way. She thought about what it meant that two people could arrive at the end of something and find it, against all expectation, not as sharp as the middle had been. Perhaps the sharpness of a marriage in difficulty is in the ongoing management of something that is not working, and when you stop managing it, when you acknowledge that it is not working and you stop, the sharpness goes too. Perhaps endings were only as hard as the things you were still pretending could be different. She did not pretend. She had always found pretending more exhausting than honesty. Even when honesty was considerably harder, this was one of the things that had sustained her through the months of preparation. She was not pretending to herself that the marriage could be saved, or that she wanted it to be saved, or that there was some version of the situation in which a different outcome was available. She had looked at the situation accurately from the beginning and had acted on what she found there. The accuracy was what made it possible to be as composed as she had been. Accuracy was always what made composure possible. She had written, in the blue notebook, 3 weeks before the dinner, "Composure is the result of certainty. A person who is uncertain wavers and shows the wavering. A person who is certain has no wavering to show." She had written it as an observation about herself and then put it away, because she was not in the habit of congratulating herself in advance. But she had found it, the evening after the morning room meeting, and read it again, and thought, yes, that was precisely it. The composure that people had seen throughout the dinner and throughout the meetings that followed was not performed. It was the outward expression of something settled and decided on the inside. You could not fake it with this quality. You could only achieve it by having done the work that produced genuine certainty, and she had done the work. Richard, she thought, had been surprised by the composure. That was the thing she saw in his face at various moments across these meetings. Not anger or guilt or any of the other things she had prepared for, but a quality of encountering something he had not expected. He had expected, perhaps, the version of her that he had been allowing himself to assume existed, the version that was the competent, composed duchess and nothing else. The version that was defined entirely by its relation to the role, rather than having an interior life that the role was only the surface of. He had been married to her for 11 years and had not known her. That was the essential fact. And the dinner, and the envelope, and all that followed, were the moment in which she corrected his misapprehension, not with drama, with evidence. She had always believed that the most powerful argument was evidence. Her father had taught her this. He had said, "Argument can be countered with argument, assertion with assertion, emotion with emotion, but evidence simply stands there and insists on being true." You could not argue with a fact. You could dispute it, but you could not make it not be a fact. And what she had brought to this entire situation was evidence of what had happened, of what she knew, of what she was capable of, and of what she intended. None of it could be argued away. It could only be responded to. And it had been responded to, in the end, reasonably. She had not needed to use the full weight of the documentation in any confrontational way, because the existence of the documentation had been sufficient. Knowing that she had it, and that it was complete, and that she had prepared it with the same thoroughness she brought to everything, had shifted the terms of the negotiation before the negotiation began. She had arrived at every meeting holding a prepared position, and the people across the table had known it, and the knowledge had shaped everything. The following week brought the formal stage of it. Prentice sent his preliminary communication to the solicitor Richard had engaged, a man named Harrington, whom Prentice described as competent and thorough. A meeting was proposed, both solicitors, both parties, in Prentice's chambers. Evelyn agreed. She agreed to the date, the time, and the location. She confirmed with Prentice, in a brief note, that her position on the Oxford property had not changed. She spent those intervening days managing the household, which required its usual level of management, and managing the children, who required their own kind of attention that was entirely different from management and that she was glad to provide. She did not think constantly about the meeting. She had found, over these weeks, that the portion of her mind given to the plan could be reduced now that the essential things had been done, and that the reduction was not a sign of diminished care, but of completed preparation. The work was done. The conversation would be what it would be. She was ready. She had been ready for some time. The rest was administration. The meeting in Prentice's chambers took place on a Monday in the second week of January. It was cold, the particular cold of London in early winter that gets into stone buildings and stays there, and Prentice's chambers had a chill that the single radiator in the corner was doing its best against. They settled around a table that Prentice had arranged with his characteristic neatness. 4 chairs, 4 glasses of water, a central space for the documents. Evelyn sat across from Richard for the first time since the morning room conversation, with a table between them and 2 men whose professional skill was the translation of human situations into the language of documents and agreements. Harrington was a man of 60, measured and experienced, with the quality of mild surprise entirely absent from his manner, which was the quality that his kind of practice demanded. He and Prentice greeted each other with the professional courtesy of men who had encountered each other's work across a table before, and had formed useful opinions of it. Evelyn watched this greeting and noted that Prentice was easy in it, which told her what she needed to know about the relative positions. The meeting lasted 2 hours and 14 minutes. They moved through the terms in the order Prentice had organized them, beginning with the children's arrangements, which was what Evelyn had asked for when she and Prentice had discussed the order of proceedings. She wanted the children settled first. Everything else was secondary to that, and she wanted the order of the conversation to reflect the order of her priorities. The arrangement for Henry and Caroline resolved with minor adjustments that Evelyn had anticipated and had given Prentice latitude to accept. The financial settlement was examined in detail. Harrington raised 3 objections, 1 reasonable and 2 not, and the reasonable one was accommodated, and the 2 unreasonable ones were addressed by Prentice, with the precision of a man who has the documentation and knows it, which is the most effective form of legal argument there is. The estate arrangements required the most time, as they always do, because the complications of a large estate and the complications of a dissolution multiply each other in ways that require patience to work through. The Oxford cottage came at the end. It was the last item on Prentice's list, and he introduced it with the quality of someone placing the final piece of something on a table where the other pieces are already assembled. Harrington's position was the one she had expected. The property was structured outside the marital estate and was therefore outside the settlement. Prentice's response was also what she had expected, because she had helped him build it over the preceding weeks. The timing and the manner of the purchase, set against the broader financial record, created a reasonable argument that the structure was not coincidental. He said this with the specific economy of a man who knows he is on solid ground and does not need to raise his voice to make the point. Harrington looked at his notes, and then he looked at Richard, and there was a beat of silence in the room that told Evelyn everything she needed to know about where that point was going to land. Harrington said he would need to take further advice on the matter. The meeting ended. They collected their things and reconvened briefly in the outer room. As Evelyn put on her coat, she found herself briefly near Richard, the solicitors occupied with a quiet professional exchange by the window. Richard was looking at the wall in the way people look at walls when they are processing something that requires more room than a room can give. He said, without turning initially and then turning, "Do you think it needed to end like this?" She thought about the question. She said, "I think the end was written earlier than either of us acknowledged. I was the one who finally wrote it down." He received this. He did not agree or disagree. He put his coat on and moved toward the door, and they parted on the pavement outside, going in different directions, which was simply the geography of it. The documents were signed on a Friday afternoon. Richard came to West Haven, which was the right thing to do. They used the library, because it was the right room. The room where she had sat on the morning the first letter arrived, where the fire was lit now because it was December, and Mr. Graves had seen to everything correctly, as he always did. Prentice came. Harrington came. The documents were produced, the places for signatures marked. They signed in turn. Evelyn first, then Richard. Harrington witnessed. Prentice witnessed. That was the legal completion of 11 years of marriage. Afterward, Prentice and Harrington made their polite departures, and Evelyn and Richard were briefly alone in the library. The fire was burning. Outside, the afternoon was gray and still. He said, "I hope you know that my feelings about Henry and Caroline don't change." She said, "I do know that, and I want you to know that I have no intention of making things difficult in that regard. They are your children. You are their father. I will not put anything between them and you." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "Thank you, Evelyn." She said, "You are welcome, Richard." It was the most genuine exchange they had had in years, and it happened at the end, which was the particular truth of it. She held it for exactly as long as it took to have it, and then she let it go, because she was very good at that, and because there were more useful things to do with the space it left behind. She pressed her hand flat against the top document for a moment, as her father used to do with briefs he had finished preparing. Then she picked up the file and carried it to her writing desk. The news moved through the household within the week. Mr. Graves was informed first, privately, by Evelyn herself, because he deserved to hear it directly and because his steadiness was something she valued and did not want to put at risk by allowing rumor to reach him before fact. He received the information with the composure that had characterized 22 years of his service, and said that the household was, as always, entirely at her direction. She thanked him and told him that, for now, nothing needed to change. She spent the days between the morning room conversation and the meeting in Prentice's chambers in the particular kind of productive suspension that she had come to associate with the later stages of large plans. Everything essential had been done, the sequence of remaining steps was clear, and what was required was steady management of the things that continued to require managing, without allowing the larger thing to consume all of the attention that the smaller things also deserved. She wrote to the Edinburgh estate agent confirming the arrangement, because the offer had been accepted and the next stage required her attention. She spoke to Mr. Graves about certain practical questions relating to the estate accounts in the coming months, which would need to be managed through a transition period that was not yet fully defined, but whose broad parameters she could already see. She attended her charity committee, where she was needed for a planning decision about the spring fundraising calendar, and she made 3 observations about the proposed schedule that improved it significantly and that were adopted immediately, as her observations usually were, because she had been on this committee for 7 years, and her observations were reliable. She managed all of this with the same surface composure and internal attentiveness she had maintained throughout the preceding months. The difference was that now the composure was not a performance of the plan. It was simply herself, inhabiting her own life, doing what she had always done. The plan had been executed. What was left was the life that came after it, and the life that came after it was beginning in exactly the incremental, ordinary way that all real changes begin. She thought, during those days, about change itself and about what it looked like from the inside versus from the outside. From the outside she understood. What had happened was dramatic. A duchess had discovered her husband's extended dishonesty and had responded to it with a plan so careful and so completely executed that it had become, in certain social circles, something approaching a story. From the inside what had happened was this. A woman had assessed an unsatisfactory situation, determined that it was not going to improve, identified her options, chosen the most appropriate one, prepared for it thoroughly, acted on her preparation, and was now living with the consequences, which were, on balance, better than what she had been living with before. That was the whole of it, nothing mystical, nothing theatrical, a decision, and the work to implement it, and the life on the other side. She had made decisions and done work and lived on the other side of them many times before. This one was larger than most, and more permanent, and required a different kind of rebuilding than the ones that had preceded it. But the fundamental nature of it was the same. She was not someone who had done something extraordinary. She was someone who had treated a difficult situation with the same seriousness and thoroughness she brought to all difficult situations, and who had been willing to follow the logic of what she found all the way to its conclusion. She thought the people who found it remarkable were, to a degree, measuring it against an expectation that she had never shared. They expected women in her position to be, in various ways, less than what she was, less prepared, less clear-eyed, less willing to act on what they knew. She had never accepted that limitation. She had simply not announced its rejection in any way that anyone had noticed. The dinner had announced it, somewhat forcefully in retrospect. She was not displeased about this. She found it, if she was honest, slightly satisfying in a way that she attributed to the specific satisfaction of disproof. Her father had argued cases against people who underestimated him. He had said, more than once, that being underestimated was a tactical advantage, that you only used once but that, used at the right moment, was among the most effective things available to a person who had prepared sufficiently. She had remembered this. She had used it. She did not intend to need it again, but she was glad she had had it when she needed it. She told her mother by letter that same week. She wrote it carefully on the plain cream paper she used for family correspondence, and she told her mother what had happened, in the order it had happened, simply and without drama. She did not ask for anything. She simply told her, because her mother deserved to know, and because Evelyn believed in directness with the people she loved. At the end she said that she was well. She wrote those words and then looked at them for a moment, testing their accuracy. They were accurate. She was not performing wellness. She was well. She sealed the letter and added it to the Morning Post. The news moved through London society in the way that significant news always moves through it, which is to say, carefully, in pieces, arriving in drawing rooms and clubs and afternoon visits, through the particular social mechanism of well-bred people who claimed not to be gossiping while doing exactly that. By February, which was 2 months after the signing, the essential facts were known in most of the households that constituted their circle, that the Duke and Duchess of Westhaven had separated, that formal proceedings had been completed, and that the matter had been handled with a degree of order that was, frankly, rather surprising given the nature of what had apparently prompted it. What was not immediately clear was which of the two had initiated it. The initial assumption in certain quarters was the one that generally gets made in such situations, which was that the husband had decided to move on. This was not an unreasonable assumption given the facts that were first available, because what people knew, initially, was that the marriage had ended, and that Richard had subsequently been seen in the company of Clara Hargrove. The sequence implied a particular cause and effect. Social inference, like legal inference, tends to move from what is visible toward the simplest available explanation, especially when the alternative explanation is less familiar. Evelyn did not at first do anything to correct it. She was not interested in the management of her reputation as a project in itself, which was one of the things that had always distinguished her from many of the women in her world. She had always cared more about the substance of things than the appearance of them, and she had always believed that substance, given sufficient time, shifts the appearance to match it. So she went on living her life as she always had, managing the estates, caring for the children, attending her charity meetings, seeing the people she valued, and she waited. The fuller picture began to assemble itself by spring. It assembled through the usual mechanisms: conversations, observations, the particular way that people who knew different pieces of the story gradually compared notes without quite intending to. Someone mentioned the Kensington property. Someone else mentioned the timeline. Someone else mentioned, more specifically, the evening of the Westhaven autumn dinner, and what they had observed, and what it looked like in retrospect. And gradually, in the way that a drawing comes into focus when you step back from it, the picture clarified. The response was more varied and more interesting than Evelyn had anticipated. Among a certain cohort, mostly women of her generation or slightly older, mostly women who had themselves navigated the particular compressed reality of a certain kind of marriage in a certain kind of world, the response was something she had not had a precise word for until Dorothy supplied one. Dorothy, who was direct about everything in the way that people who have been honest their whole lives are direct, said that several women of her acquaintance had used the word respect when talking about what Evelyn had done. Not pity, Dorothy emphasized, not sympathy. Respect. There was a meaningful difference, and the difference was entirely in the direction of the intended compliment. Evelyn received, over those months, a considerable number of letters that she found more interesting than they perhaps expected to be. Women she knew well, and women she knew only slightly. and a few women she had never met in person, who had somehow heard of her and felt moved to write. The letters were couched in the language that social propriety required, notes of congratulation on how well she was managing, inquiries after the children, references to things they had in common. But underneath the surface language there was something more direct, and she read it in each letter without difficulty. What they were saying, in the polished vocabulary of their world, was, "You did what many of us have thought about and none of us have done. And we notice, and we think it matters." She kept every one of those letters in a box in her writing desk. She labeled the box in her own small notation. Some things did not require an audience. The letters she received in the months after the news became known had a variety that she found, from a strictly analytical standpoint, quite interesting. They came from the expected quarters, old school friends who had heard through networks she barely remembered, charity acquaintances who had a kind of formal sympathy that was also, underneath, genuine. The 2 or 3 women she had known slightly whose own marriages had similar silences in them and who wrote to her with a quality of recognition that they did not quite state. But they also came from unexpected quarters, women who had met her only once, at a dinner or a committee or a mutual friends event, and who had nonetheless felt moved to write something. And a handful of men which surprised her, who wrote to say that they admired the manner in which she had conducted herself, which was a carefully worded thing to say and which she read, each time, as meaning slightly more than it said. She answered every letter. This was her practice, and she did not deviate from it. She answered with the brevity and warmth that the situation warranted, which was different for each letter because each situation was slightly different, and she filed the letters in the box she was maintaining for the purpose. She was not entirely sure why she was keeping them. She had not decided to write anything about this period, not yet, and the letters were not documentation in the legal sense, but they were a record of something, and she had always believed in keeping records of things she suspected might have meaning she had not yet identified. There was one letter that she returned to several times, not because it said anything that the others did not say, but because it said what several others said in a way that was so direct and unadorned that she found it difficult to set aside. It came from a woman she had met once, 3 years earlier, at a conference for women in estate management, and who she would not have described as a close acquaintance or even a regular one. The woman said, in 3 short paragraphs, that she had heard about the divorce, and that she wanted to say one thing, that she had been in a similar situation 4 years earlier and had not done what Evelyn had done, and that she had spent the intervening 4 years wondering whether she should have, and that reading about what Evelyn had done had given her something she had not expected to find, which was not regret exactly but something like clarity about the choice she had made, and the choice that had existed. She did not ask for anything. She thanked Evelyn for nothing specific. She simply wrote the 3 paragraphs and signed her name and sent the letter. Evelyn held that letter for a long time after she read it. She thought about what it cost to write something that honest to someone you barely knew. She thought about the woman sitting down with a pen and a piece of paper and working out how to say something real, which is always harder than saying something polished. She wrote back at length, which she did not always do, and said things she had not expected to say. She said that she understood the woman's position in a way that she could not have understood a year earlier. She said that the question of when to act and when not to act was one of the most difficult questions she knew of, because the answer was different for every situation and there was no general rule that applied to all of them, only the specific truth of each specific situation, which only the person inside it could fully assess. She said that the woman's choice to stay, 4 years earlier, was not a failure simply because it was not what Evelyn had done. It was a different choice, made in different circumstances by a different person, and different did not mean lesser. She signed the letter and posted it, and then sat for a while in the Edinburgh morning room with the last of her tea and thought about choices. She had always made her choices carefully. She had not always made them quickly, or easily, or without the weight that serious decisions carry. But she had made them, and she had stood by them, and the standing by them was, she thought, at least as important as the making of them. The courage, if that was the right word, was not in the dinner. The dinner was the end of something, not the beginning. The beginning had been the morning in October when she read the letter and sat quietly for 3 days, and then wrote to Finch. The beginning had been the decision that what she knew was something she was going to do something about, rather than something she was going to accommodate and continue to carry. That was the moment that deserved whatever word people wanted to use for what she had done. After that moment, everything else was work. And she was very good at work. In other quarters, the reaction was more complicated. There was a subset of people who found the whole situation faintly unsettling in a way they could not quite articulate and therefore expressed indirectly. The dinner, for instance. Was it quite right, inviting that woman? There was a sense, in these discussions, of something having been done that fell outside the expected script for how a woman in this situation conducted herself, and the falling outside the script was what was uncomfortable, not the content of what had been done. Because the content, examined directly, was reasonable. She had ended a marriage that had been conducted dishonestly. She had done it legally, with documentation, in a way that protected her children and secured a fair settlement. These were not objectionable things. What was objectionable to this subset was the quality of preparation that had been brought to them, the planning, the composure, the particular quality of a woman who had known what she knew, said nothing, and moved with complete deliberateness at the moment of her own choosing. That, she understood, was the thing. Not what she had done, but the way she had done it. She had assumed she was the most strategically aware person in the room, and she had been right, and in the rooms of her particular world, that assumption was not one that women were generally expected to make, much less prove. She had expected this response. It had not changed anything about her decisions, because she had understood from the beginning that the choice was not between an action that everyone approved of and one that some did not. The choice was between an action that served her actual interests and one that served her perceived role. She had always found the perceived role insufficient. This was simply the first time she had said so in a way that was heard. Richard married Clara Hargrove in a ceremony in April of the following year. It was quieter than one might have expected, attended by fewer of their shared acquaintance than Richard might have hoped, perhaps because the circumstances of the first marriage's end had generated a quality of social uncertainty that made some people hesitant to celebrate the new beginning without having entirely settled their feelings about the old one. Evelyn did not attend. She was in Edinburgh the weekend of the wedding, and she did not make a particular point of being in Edinburgh. It was simply where she was. She sent a gift, a silver picture frame, simple and well-made, from a jeweler in Edinburgh whose work she had come to trust. She chose the frame with care, because she believed that even gifts sent to people you are not close to should be chosen with care. She included no card. There was nothing she needed to write. The gift said what it said to the people who could read it, and to the people who could not, it was a silver frame, which was a perfectly appropriate gift for any occasion. She told Henry and Caroline in January, 3 weeks after the signing. She sat with them in the nursery sitting room on a Sunday afternoon, in the good winter light, and she used the simplest language she could find. She told them she and their father had decided it would be better for everyone if they lived in different houses, and that this did not change anything about how much either of them was loved. She told them they would see their father often. She told them the arrangement had been decided by both adults together, and was what both adults thought was best. Henry asked whether they would have to leave this house. She said no. He nodded in the solemn way he had, processing and filing the information. Caroline cried briefly, as Evelyn had expected, and Evelyn held her without saying anything for a few minutes because that was what the moment required. When Caroline had finished, she asked whether Daddy would come for Christmas. Evelyn said yes. He would come in the morning and they would have presents together, and then they would each have their own Christmas from that point, and it would be different but good. Caroline asked whether they could have a dog. Evelyn said she would think about it. She thought about it for 3 months and then got a spaniel named Edmund, which turned out to be one of the better decisions of that particular year, and this was a year in which she had made several very good decisions. Prentice had said something to her, at their final meeting before the dinner, that she had thought about several times since. He had said, "In my experience, the cases that resolve most efficiently are the ones where the person who has been wronged has done the preparation, rather than the person who has done the wrong." She had asked him what he meant, and he had explained, in the careful way he explained things, that in any negotiation, the party who has assembled the complete picture has an inherent structural advantage, because they know exactly what the situation is, and what can be proved, while the other party is working partly in the dark. The person who has been wronged, if they have done their preparation, knows more than the person who did the wronging, because the person who did the wronging has been conducting themselves in the assumption that the situation will not be examined, whereas the person who has been wronged has spent months examining it with professional assistance. She had thought about this observation a great deal. It was precise and practical, and had a quality of honest assessment of human behavior that she had always responded to. It was also, she thought, a wider truth than its legal application. It applied to most situations in which one person behaves badly, in the assumption that their behavior will not be examined. They have not done any preparation for being caught, because the preparation for being caught would require acknowledging the possibility of being caught, and the acknowledgement would undermine the comfortable assumption of safety. Whereas the person who has decided to respond to the bad behavior has, if they are the kind of person she was, prepared with complete thoroughness. The assumption of the person who behaves badly is always their vulnerability. She had always known this. Her father had taught it. Her mother had demonstrated it. And she had applied it here, as she had applied all the things they had given her, with as much precision as the situation required. What she had found, in applying it, was something she had not expected. She had found that the preparation itself was a form of justice, prior to and separate from any legal outcome. The act of seeing the situation clearly, assembling the evidence, understanding every dimension of it, making the decision from that full understanding, and carrying it out with the thoroughness it deserved, all of that had been something to which she had a right, and exercising the right had been its own resolution, regardless of anything that followed in the legal or social domain. She had done what a person with her intelligence and her resources and her absolute commitment to doing things properly could do. Nothing more and nothing less, and the doing of it had been what mattered. The rest was administration. Important administration, with significant consequences for her practical life. But administration, she thought, at various points in those Edinburgh years, about the particular relationship between privacy and strength. Not the privacy of secrecy, which was a different thing and which she associated with things people were ashamed of or afraid to have known, but the privacy of the interior, the part of yourself that you do not put on public display, and that does not therefore become subject to other people's management of it. She had always maintained this distinction very carefully. The composure she showed the world was not a lie. It was a choice about what to display. Underneath it, there had always been the rest of her, the thinking, the feeling, the deciding, the particular quality of interior life that she had never been willing to offer up to anyone who had not earned it. Richard had not earned it. She had understood this, in retrospect, quite early in the marriage, and had adjusted accordingly, maintaining the interface of a competent and agreeable wife, without ever offering the deeper parts of herself to someone who would not have known what to do with them. This was not a cruel calculation. It was a practical one, made by a person who had learned, from her parents and from experience, that the interior is worth protecting, because it is where you actually live. The people she had given the interior to were few: her mother, her father, in the years before his death when she had been old enough to be his intellectual companion as well as his daughter, Dorothy, her children, in the particular way that parents give themselves to children, which is not exactly the same as giving yourself to another adult but is, in its depth and its lack of reserve, the most complete form of it. And certain friends, made over the years, who had proved themselves worthy of the trust through the slow accumulation of shown character. She was not, she thought, an easy person to know well. She knew this about herself without apology. She had always required a certain kind of attention and a certain kind of intelligence from the people she admitted to any real closeness, and she had not been willing to settle for less, simply because settling would have been more convenient. This was why her close friendships were few and her acquaintances were many. The acquaintances were pleasant and were good at what they were good at, which was the surface interactions of social life. The friends were different. They were people she had tested, over time, against her actual self, and who had proved equal to the test. She thought, in these Edinburgh years, that this was one of the things the divorce had changed, or perhaps clarified, her understanding of what she needed from the people in her life, and her willingness to articulate it, not loudly, not as a demand, but simply as a fact of herself, that she was no longer in the habit of obscuring. She knew what she was. She knew what she needed. She had stopped apologizing for the precision of either. The Edinburgh house was smaller than Westhaven by a considerable measure, which suited Evelyn in ways she had not expected, and was glad to discover. It had 3 bedrooms, a narrow garden at the back, a sitting room that faced west and caught the evening light in a way she found genuinely beautiful, and a kitchen that had been recently renovated, and in which she found, to her considerable surprise, that she actually enjoyed cooking simple things. She had spent 11 years managing a household that employed a cook. She had not previously known that she found it satisfying to make soup herself, alone, in a quiet kitchen at 7 in the evening, with the radio on and the gray Edinburgh rain at the windows. She found quite a lot of things during those first months that she had not previously known about herself. This was one of the things she had hoped for, in a vague way, when she had allowed herself, in those careful months of planning, to imagine the room on the other side of the door. She had known it would be different. She had not known, precisely, what the difference would feel like from the inside. Now she knew. It felt like space, not the empty, anxious kind of space that follows a loss, but the productive kind, the kind that arrives when the thing that was occupying all the room has been removed, and you discover that in the room there are now things you have time to look at and explore and develop. She slept differently. This was one of the first things she noticed. She had been, for years, a light and fractured sleeper, waking at small noises, lying awake with running lists, coming to consciousness at 5 in the morning with the day's concerns already assembled and waiting. In Edinburgh, in the narrow west-facing bedroom with the rain on the glass, she slept heavily, and woke feeling what her grandmother used to call put together. It was such a simple thing. She found it remarkable. She kept Westhaven. She went back for weeks at a time, managing the estates, spending long stretches with Henry and Caroline, overseeing the practical machinery of a large household that still required oversight. Richard had his own household now, and his visits to see the children were regular and largely uncomplicated. He was, whatever else he was, a present and caring father, and Evelyn had been careful from the beginning not to put anything in the way of that. The children moved between the two arrangements with the adaptability of children who have been told the truth and trusted to handle it. Henry, now 11, had become interested in the history of the estates, who had owned them, when, and what had changed. He asked his mother, one afternoon when they were walking the south pasture, who would eventually inherit Westhaven. Evelyn said that was something they would all need to think about together over the years, and that he had a great deal of time to understand it before any decisions needed to be made. He found this satisfying, because it told him the question was being taken seriously. Caroline, now 8, had obtained Edmund. The spaniel had appeared in January as promised, and had immediately installed himself in every room of the house simultaneously, or so it seemed, and had become within a week as central to the domestic life of Westhaven as any of the furniture. Evelyn had not expected to love the dog quite as much as she did. She found this slightly embarrassing and entirely real. In Edinburgh, she began writing. It started as something quite small. She had always kept working notebooks, the kind she used to think through problems and record observations. What was in those notebooks had always been primarily functional, notes on the management of things she was responsible for. But there had always been a thread of something else running through them, observations about the way things worked or the particular logic of situations that were not immediately legible but that became clear when you looked at them from the right angle. These observations had lived in the margins. After the divorce, the margins got longer. She had, for the first time in a very long time, something that could be called unoccupied time. Not a great deal of it, because she was not a person who allowed herself a great deal of unoccupied time, but enough that the margins expanded, and what had been marginal began to want more room. She gave it the room. She began to take the observations out of the margins and develop them on their own terms. She wrote about the management of complex households as a discipline that had a logic and a methodology, and a set of learned skills that were as real and as transferable as the skills of any other profession, and that were almost never acknowledged as such. She wrote about the invisible work of administration, the kind that consists of knowing what needs to happen before it needs to happen, and ensuring that it does, and absorbing the friction of all the ways it doesn't quite happen correctly, and doing all of this without anyone knowing any of it is occurring. She wrote about financial management and social coordination, and the particular expertise of people who hold large systems together, without being thanked for it or even seen. She showed 3 of these early pieces to a woman she met at a gathering in Edinburgh that autumn, a woman named Patricia Hartley who was in her 50s, and who ran a small press that produced books she described, with a cheerful directness, as useful. Evelyn showed her the 3 pieces without expectation. Patricia read them over the following week and came back with a proposal. The book was published the following autumn, a slim, well-designed volume with a practical title and a clear audience. It was not the kind of book that made headlines. It was the kind of book that landed in the hands of people who needed it, and was treated by those people as exactly what it was, useful. Within a year she had received more than 80 letters about it. The letters came from women who managed large properties and had recognized themselves in the descriptions and felt, perhaps for the first time, that their expertise was real enough to have been written about. She read every letter and answered every one, because she believed in answering correspondence. The letters were, in aggregate, more interesting than any review the book received. They told her that there was an audience for this kind of thing, and that the audience was larger than the visible world of her particular social circle. The second book took 3 years. It was a wider work, covering the broader question of the kind of intelligence that administers complex systems, the kind exercised daily by women who hold together the operational reality of large households and organizations, and that is almost entirely invisible, because it succeeds by preventing things from going wrong, rather than by creating visible dramatic successes. This was her most interesting subject. She wrote about it with the authority of someone who had done the thing they were writing about at a high level for many years. Henry was 17 when it was published, in the thick of his examinations, and he read it in 2 sittings and told his mother over dinner that the chapter on financial accountability structures was particularly strong. She told him she was glad, and that if he intended to manage any part of the Westhaven estate in his adult life, the principles in that chapter would apply directly. Caroline, who was 14 and interested in almost everything at once, read the book more slowly, and asked questions over several weeks. the kinds of questions that told Evelyn she was thinking rather than simply reading. Both of these things made her quietly and enormously glad. She was interviewed for a radio documentary the year the second book came out. A producer named Margaret Fleet made programs about women of the mid-century and what they had done with the particular circumstances of their times. She came to Edinburgh, to the west-facing room, with a recording device and the kind of directness in her questions that Evelyn always found more respectful than the apologetic softening that some people applied to difficult things. Margaret asked about the dinner. She asked about it in her second question, after the books and the writing, and she asked it directly. What had Evelyn intended by it, and how had she decided when to act? Evelyn said what she had said to Prentice years before, that she had been certain since October. She said she had spent those months preparing in a way that left no meaningful gap. She said she had chosen the dinner as the moment, not for dramatic reasons but for practical ones, a context she controlled, a room she had spent 11 years constructing into exactly what she needed it to be, a moment she could choose for herself rather than having it chosen for her. Margaret asked, "Were you frightened?" Evelyn was quiet for a moment, not from uncertainty, but from the honesty she brought to questions that deserved it. She thought about the morning room in October. She thought about the cold November light when she had been riding across the lower pasture. She thought about the envelope in the evening bag, and the dining room full of candlelight, and the particular quality of composure that she had sustained for months, and then sustained further, right through the moment when she had placed the envelope beside his hand, and walked back to her seat, and asked Dorothy about the play. She said, "No, I wasn't frightened. And I want to be clear about why, because the reason matters. I wasn't frightened because I had done the work. All of it. Every piece of it. The documentation, the legal preparation, the financial review, the planning of the occasion, the writing of the letter, the choice of the moment. By the time I stood behind his chair at the dinner table, there was nothing left that I hadn't addressed. There was no gap. And when there is no gap, there is nothing for fear to live in. Fear is what happens when you know there is something you haven't done. Something you aren't ready for. I was ready. That was the whole point of everything I had done for those months. The dinner was not the act of courage. The preparation was. The dinner was simply the delivery of everything I had already done. Margaret wrote something, and then she said, "What would you say to someone who is in the situation you were in, before October?" Evelyn considered this. She said, "I would say, understand the situation fully before you act. Not because action requires certainty. Sometimes waiting for certainty is itself the wrong choice. But because understanding gives you options, and options give you power. The kind of power that comes from knowing what you are doing and why, and being prepared to do it correctly." She paused. "And I would say, do not confuse composure with passivity. They look similar from the outside. They are completely different things. Passivity is the absence of a decision. Composure is what you look like when you have made one and are carrying it out." Margaret said she thought that was the best thing she had heard all year. The program was broadcast in the spring. Evelyn listened to it in the Edinburgh kitchen while making soup. She listened to herself say the things she had said, and found that most of them were accurate and one or two could have been more precise, but on the whole she was satisfied. Dorothy telephoned that evening. She had also listened. She said, "The bit about composure and passivity, that's going in the quotation book." Evelyn said, "I have a quotation book." Dorothy said, "I have one on your behalf. You've been filling it for years without knowing." Evelyn said she would have to think about how she felt about that. Dorothy said she didn't have to feel anything about it. It was already done. Evelyn said yes. In retrospect, that sounded right. She hung up and looked at the soup on the stove, which was ready. She poured it into a bowl and took it to the small table by the window. The evening was going blue around the city. Edmund was at her feet. The soup was good. She had made it herself, which she still found, after several years, slightly surprising and completely satisfying. She picked up the book she had been reading, a history of the Italian Renaissance that she had been moving through with great pleasure for 3 weeks, and she read for a while, and ate, and listened to the city outside the windows. She put the book down at a certain point and looked out at the evening without thinking about anything in particular, which was something she had learned to do in these years, to simply be in a moment, without requiring it to produce anything. This had taken practice. She was constitutionally a person who used her mind constantly and productively, and allowing it to be still, even briefly, had not come naturally, but she had practiced it, as she practiced everything she decided was worth having. She thought, in the loose, undirected way of someone who is not steering their thoughts, about the whole of it. The letter in October, the first cup of tea after reading it, the note to Finch posted in the thin autumn morning, the meeting with Prentice in the rain, the 40 invitations written over 2 evenings, the dark green silk dress, The envelope in the evening bag, flat against the silk lining. The long table, with its candles and crystal. The moment between the third and fourth courses when she rose from her chair. The envelope placed beside his hand. The walk back to her seat, Dorothy and the play. And then all the things after. The morning room. Prentice's chambers. The signed papers in the library. Edinburgh in January. The first time she had stayed for more than a week. Edmund. The books. The mornings at her desk with tea and the particular Edinburgh light. The conversations with Henry about the estate, which were becoming more substantive every year. The conversations with Caroline about everything, which were always the conversations she had not expected, and which were always the best ones. Dorothy, on the phone and in person and in letters, because both of them were women who believed in the lasting value of written correspondence. The west-facing room in the evening light. The Edinburgh Hills in spring, which she had now seen several times and hoped to see many more. The whole of it, from the letter on the Wednesday morning to this bowl of soup in this kitchen in this city that had become, fully and without any remaining qualification, her home. She had spent a large portion of her life being very competent at things that were not quite hers. She had spent the portion that remained being very competent at things that were entirely hers. The difference between those two modes of living was not always visible from the outside. People who had known her before and who knew her now would likely say that she seemed the same, which in the superficial qualities was true. She was still precise and organized and composed in the specific way that had always been hers. But the inside of it was different in the way that a room looks different when it is yours, even if the walls have not moved. She finished the soup. She washed the bowl. She put Edmund on his bed and turned off the kitchen light. She went upstairs, and she read for an hour in the west-facing room, and then she went to bed and slept deeply, as she had slept deeply in this house for years. In the morning she would write. She had been thinking, for several weeks, about a third book, something different from the first two. Something that came at the question of how people make decisions in situations of significant uncertainty from a different angle. She had not told Patricia about it yet. She was still seeing what shape it wanted to take, but it was there, beginning to organize itself in the way that all serious things organize themselves, slowly, and from the inside out, and with the particular quality of something that is not going to stop until it is finished. She thought sometimes about the version of herself who had received the letter in October, and had sat at the writing desk and decided, in the particular still quality of that October morning, that she was going to do something about it. She thought about that woman with something that was not quite tenderness but was close to it, the way you feel about someone who was carrying something heavy and did not yet know that they were about to put it down. She had been carrying a very heavy thing for a very long time. She had carried it so well, and for so long, that she had partially lost awareness of the weight. It was only when she had finally set it down that she understood how heavy it had been. The Edinburgh house was light in a specific way that the Westhaven house was not. Westhaven was beautiful, deeply and genuinely beautiful, with the particular beauty of a very old house that has been cared for well over a long period of time, and that has accumulated, in its stones and its proportions and its gardens, something that can only be called character. She loved it, and she continued to love it, and she went back to it regularly, and found each return satisfying. But Westhaven was also, always, a house that had been built to a scale and for a purpose that exceeded the private, and there was something in it that resisted the purely personal. It was a house for a way of life, not a house for a person. The Edinburgh house was for her. She had chosen it for herself, with her own money, according to her own sense of what she needed, and it fitted her in the way that things made or chosen precisely to purpose always fit, without extra material, without wasted space, without the gap between the thing and the person using it, that indicates a mismatch between form and function. She had not known, before she lived in it, how much she had wanted a house that fitted. She knew now. She knew in the mornings when she came downstairs and the light was coming through the west-facing room's windows in the particular way it did at that hour, and she made tea and took it to her desk, and she sat and opened the notebook and began. She knew it in the evenings when she closed the notebook and made supper and read and the city wound down around her. She knew it in every ordinary day of a life that was, finally, the size and shape of herself. Dorothy visited at least twice a year, sometimes more. Their friendship had always had the quality of correspondence that some of the best friendships develop, sustaining itself across distance without losing depth. Dorothy was one of the people who understood what had happened, not only the facts of it but the interior landscape of it, the years of management and accommodation that had preceded it, and the particular quality of the decision when it finally came. She and Evelyn did not always talk about this directly. They had talked about it directly in the first years after, with the completeness that close friendship allows, and now they had the whole of it as a shared understanding that ran underneath their conversations without needing to be restated. This was one of the great gifts of a very old friendship, the not needing to restate. She was 63 in the year the third book was published. Patricia Hartley, who had become over the years something closer to a friend than a professional relationship, though she was also always a professional relationship, received the manuscript with the precision of someone who has been expecting a particular thing and found it to be exactly what she expected. The book was different from the first two, as Evelyn had intended it to be, more inward, more concerned with the process of decision-making and the nature of the kind of intelligence that holds complex things together, rather than with the practical management of those things directly. It had taken 3 years to write and had been, of the three, the hardest to write, because it required her to look at things she had not looked at directly before. She had been willing to look. That, she supposed, was the thing. 63, and still willing to look at things. Still willing to do the work of seeing clearly. Still refusing the accommodation, the polite looking away, the comfortable version of the truth that was not the actual truth. She had been this way her whole life. She would be this way until the end of it. There was something in the thinking that went, "This is what I am, and this is all right." Not contentment exactly, because contentment had always struck her as a state adjacent to stopping, and she had never stopped, but something durable and solid and specifically hers, the knowledge of what she was capable of, and the willingness to keep using it. Henry, who was now 26, and who had begun, in the preceding 2 years, to take on real responsibility for aspects of the West Haven estate, read the third book and said it was the best of the three. She told him she thought he might be right. He asked her whether she had always known she would write. She said no, she had not always known. She had discovered it when she had the room for it. He thought about this and then said something that surprised her. "I think you always wrote. You just wrote in other forms before." She looked at him and thought he was not wrong, and told him so, and felt, not for the first time and not for the last, the particular pleasure of being known accurately by someone you loved. Caroline, who was 23 and studying law, which nobody who knew her was surprised by, read the third book in 2 days and telephoned to say that the chapter on the relationship between preparation and courage was the best thing she had read about decision-making outside of a legal textbook, and possibly including them. Evelyn said she was glad. She said she hoped it was useful for the cases Caroline would eventually make. Caroline said she thought it already was, that she had been thinking about it in terms of a case she was working through in her studies, and Evelyn asked about the case, and they talked for 40 minutes about the logic of it, and Evelyn made some observations about the strength of the position, and Caroline made some counter-observations, and by the end they had both said several things that were useful, and that they had not had before the conversation, which was the measure of a good conversation. When she hung up, Edmund was at her feet, graying now at the muzzle, with the specific ease of an elderly dog who has found the right place and intends to stay in it. She looked at him for a moment. She made more tea. She sat at the desk and opened the notebook and looked at the notes she had made earlier in the day. She was 63 years old. She had lived several lives, in the way that people who live long and attentively do. The life of her childhood, in the Kensington house with the barrister father and the precise mother. The life of the young wife learning the shape of a house and a role and a world. The life of the mother, which was not a phase but a continuing thing, her longest and most sustaining thing. The life of the woman who understood finally what she was doing, and why, and made the decision that opened the door. And now this life, the writing life, the Edinburgh life, the life that fitted, the life she had built herself, out of all the skills and qualities and understandings that the previous lives had given her. She had not wasted any of it. That was what she thought, looking at Edmund's graying muzzle and the stack of notebooks on her desk and the view from the west-facing window that she had come to love so completely that she thought it would be one of the last things she saw in her mind's eye, if she was lucky, the particular quality of Edinburgh evening light. She had not wasted any of it, not even the years of the arrangement, not even the years of holding up what she had been holding up, because all of it had made her what she was. The precision and the endurance and the absolute refusal to collapse under the weight of things that might have collapsed a person who had not been built the way she was built. All of it had gone into her. All of it was in the work. The third book, when it was published, received attention that the first two had not. She had not expected this. She had written it for the same reason she had written the others, because there was something in her that needed to be said, and because she was capable of saying it well, and she had not calibrated its reception in advance, because calibrating reception in advance was the kind of thinking that interfered with honest writing. But the third book arrived in a world that was, in various small ways, more ready for it than the world had been for the first two. The conversation about the particular kind of intelligence that manages complex systems had expanded in her absence from it, and the book landed in the middle of a growing body of thought and found its place there. She was asked to speak more often than before. She said yes when the invitation felt like it was asking her for something real, and she said no when it felt like it was asking her to be a symbol of something, because she had never been interested in being a symbol, and she was 63 years old, and past the point of doing things she was not interested in out of politeness. She wrote back to the people who sent the polite refusal invitations with a precision that was also a kindness. She explained what she was not able to offer, and sometimes suggested what might be more useful to them, and occasionally, in the cases where the organization seemed to be doing something genuinely interesting, offered a different form of participation that was more specifically what she could contribute. She was asked, once, by a woman who ran a program for young women considering careers in estate management, whether she would be willing to speak to a group of about 20 of them. She said yes immediately, because estate management was her genuine subject, the thing she had actually done and done well, and she had always found it more satisfying to be specific and expert rather than generally inspiring. She spent an afternoon with 20 women between the ages of 20 and 35, and she told them what she knew, which was considerable, and she answered their questions with the directness she always brought to questions that deserved it. One of the young women asked her, at the end, what the single most useful piece of advice was that she could give. She had thought about it, because she did not give unprepared answers to questions of genuine substance. Then she said, "Know your documents. Whatever you are managing, know the documents behind it, as well as or better than anyone else in the room. Not because it makes you seem competent, but because it actually makes you competent, and because actual competence is worth more than any reputation for it. The reputation follows the competence if the competence is real. It does not work the other way around." The young woman wrote it down. Several others did too. Evelyn watched them write it and thought that was satisfying, in a way that she would not have predicted this kind of afternoon could be satisfying. She had always thought of herself as someone who worked rather than someone who advised. But perhaps, at 63, the two things were beginning to overlap in ways they had not earlier. She picked up her pen. She opened the notebook to the next page, which was blank and waiting. She wrote the date in the top left corner, in the small clear hand she had always used, and would always use, because some habits were simply expressions of what you were. Then she began. Outside, Edinburgh was being exactly what it had always been, itself. And the evening light was coming through the window in exactly the way it always did, and the tea was good, and the work was there, and she was ready. She had always been ready, in the end. That was the whole of it. That was everything. She had come to think of the whole experience, in the years since it was complete, as a lesson in the relationship between time and courage. She had always known that preparation required time. What she had not fully understood before was that courage also required time. Not the courage of a moment, but the courage that is built slowly out of the accumulation of small decisions, each of which closes off one future and opens another, until you are standing at the door of the thing you have been building toward, and you discover that you have been building your courage alongside the plan, that the two things have been constructed in parallel, and that by the time you act you are not reaching for something outside yourself, but expressing something that has become entirely interior. She had been courageous at the dinner. She knew this. And she accepted it without false modesty, because false modesty was a form of dishonesty, and she had no patience for dishonesty in any form, including the polite social variety. But the courage of the dinner was not the courage of the moment. It was the courage of October, when she had read 4 lines on a cream page and decided that she was going to do something about them. It was the courage of the walk to the post box with the letter to Finch. It was the courage of the first meeting with Prentice, when she sat in a stranger's chambers and said, "I have been certain since October," with the voice she had been practicing, without knowing she was practicing it, for 11 years. It was the courage of the Edinburgh offer, accepted on the morning of the dinner, the commitment to a future she had not yet arrived in but was already certain she intended to inhabit. By the time she rose from her chair between the 3rd and 4th courses, the courage was simply there. It had been built. It had nowhere else to go but forward. She thought about this sometimes when she was writing, because writing required the same kind of courage and was produced by the same process. You did not sit down at the desk with the courage already formed and complete. You built it, sentence by sentence, draft by draft, the willingness to say the true thing rather than the easier thing, to look at the material honestly and record what you found rather than what you wished to find. The courage of writing was the courage of the small continuous decisions that added up, over time, to something that could hold the weight of a real idea honestly expressed. It was the same muscle. She had been exercising it her whole life, without always knowing that that was what she was doing. Her mother had called it backbone. Her father had called it preparation. Dorothy called it Evelyn being Evelyn, which was perhaps the most accurate description. She called it the only way she knew how to be, which was the most honest one. In Edinburgh, in the mornings, she wrote, In the afternoons, she attended to the practical matters of a life that was, in its current form, her own invention, and her own responsibility, and her own pleasure. In the evenings, she read and walked with Edmund and talked to Dorothy or to the children on the telephone, and occasionally sat in the west-facing room watching the light go and thinking about nothing in particular, which was one of the great gifts of a life that had enough room in it. She was, she thought, in the simplest and most complete sense of the word, well, not happy in the effervescent, unreliable way of people who have decided happiness is the primary goal, but well, rooted, functional, purposeful, clear-eyed, capable, cared for and caring, doing work that mattered to her, and that appeared to matter to others, living in a place that fitted, surrounded by people who knew her. That was enough. It was, she thought, considerably more than enough. It was the thing she had made when she decided to make something, out of the ruins of an arrangement that had served its time, and was no longer serving anything except the convenience of someone else's assumptions. She had made it herself. It was entirely hers. Edmund shifted at her feet and made a small noise that was not quite a sigh but was adjacent to one, the noise of a dog who has found the right spot and is settling more deeply into it. She looked at him and felt the specific warmth she always felt when she looked at Edmund, which was a warmth she had not expected and had never quite got over the slight surprise of. She picked up her pen. She had said, to Margaret Fleet, that the preparation was the courage and the dinner was the delivery. She had believed this when she said it, and she believed it still, but she had come to understand, in the years since, that there was a third element that she had not named in that conversation, the after, the long, ordinary, thoroughly inhabited after. The years in which the decision that had felt so large and so final turned out to be not a ending, but the hinge on which a life turned, and the life turned, and went on, in the direction she had chosen for it. The after was also work. Not the concentrated, purposeful, against a deadline work of the months of preparation, but the different, sustained work of building something day by day, without the urgency that a specific goal provides. The work of becoming accustomed to freedom, which sounds easy, and is not. The work of finding, in the space where the arrangement had been, what she actually was when she was not defined by the arrangement. The work of the books, and the writing, and the relationships that deepened without the constraint of performing a role, and the relationship with her children that had been good before and became different afterward, not more loving but more honest, because she was more honestly herself in their presence than she had been when she was managing a version of herself in their presence. The after was the longest part. It was still ongoing. She was in it. She intended to remain in it for as long as she had, and to inhabit it with the same thoroughness she had brought to everything else, because she had never been a person who did things halfway, and she was not going to start now. She had the work, and the house, and the dog, and the children, and Dorothy, and the Edinburgh evenings, and the notebooks, and the particular quality of her own mind, which was still the thing she most relied on, and still the thing she was most grateful for. Everything else had been contingent. This was not. Outside, Edinburgh was doing what it always did, being precisely and entirely what it was, without apology and without decoration, and the light was the Edinburgh light, which was unlike any other light she had ever known, and she had come to love it completely, and the page was blank and waiting, and she was ready. She had always been ready, in the end. She began. She turned off the light. Outside, Edinburgh was doing what Edinburgh always does at night, which is to be exactly what it is, solid, clear, and entirely itself, with no apology for its own nature, and no desire to be anywhere else. She found this, as she found most things about Edinburgh, entirely appropriate. She closed her eyes. She had decided something, at 40, that had taken all of the 11 years before it to be ready to decide, and all of the years after it to unfold into everything it was. The deciding had been the hardest part, not because the decision was unclear, but because she had needed to be entirely and irrevocably ready, and readiness of that quality takes time. It takes documentation and legal preparation, and a blue notebook in a locked drawer, and 40 invitations written in 2 evenings, and a dark green silk dress, and a cream envelope in an evening bag, and a single sentence said quietly between the 3rd and 4th courses of a dinner that was the best she had ever given. And then it was done. And then it was only beginning, because the decision was not the end of anything. The decision was the door, and she had walked through it, and on the other side was a room she had built herself, out of everything she knew and everything she had learned and everything she had decided to be. It was hers. Every corner of it. Every window and every piece of furniture, and every morning when she sat at her desk with tea beside her and opened the notebook to the next blank page. She was, and had been for some time now, precisely where she had intended to be. She slept.